Egypt in the Hellenistic age was built on a very old and distinctive landscape. Long before Alexander, it was already a large, coherent kingdom centered on the Nile, a narrow, fertile ribbon of land running through otherwise harsh desert. Most people lived in villages and small towns along this valley, especially in Upper and Middle Egypt, while the broad, busy delta connected the country to the Mediterranean. The Fayum Basin, linked to the Nile by canals, was another rich agricultural zone that became a special focus of later irrigation projects. Around this core lay deserts with oases in the west, quarries and mines in the eastern hills, and Red Sea ports such as Myos Hormos, Lukos Laman, and Berenica, which opened routes toward Africa and the Indian Ocean. Egypt's greatest wealth, however, was the Nile flood. Yearly, fairly reliable, but demanding intense management through canals, embankments, and careful settlement patterns on higher ground. Socially and politically, Egypt was already a highly centralized monarchy. The king, Pharaoh, stood at the top of a steep hierarchy, with powerful temples and priesthoods below him, controlling large estates and much of the redistribution of goods. Foreign rulers, such as the Persians, had already learned that they needed to cooperate with Egyptian gods and priests if they wanted legitimacy. Under the Ptolemies, this basic structure persisted. The countryside was filled mainly with small-holding farmers who paid taxes in kind and were legally free, even if heavily controlled. When pressures became too great, they could protest by fleeing to temples or into the desert. Going up to seek sanctuary and protection, Egypt's population was ethnically mixed in major towns. Greeks, Phoenicians, Carians, Jews, Idumeans, and others lived alongside Egyptians, and order was preserved with garrisons and military colonies. Yet for most villagers, daily life under the Ptolemies changed slowly and looked very similar under earlier pharaohs and later Roman emperors. Egypt is unusually visible to historians because of its papyri. Tens of thousands of documents, administrative orders, tax records, letters, contracts, and bits of literature survive thanks to the dry climate and the reuse of old papyrus in mummy casings. Ostraca, inscribed pottery sherds, add countless small notes and receipts, especially about taxation, while stone inscriptions, including the Rosetta Stone, offer official declarations and priestly decrees. Alongside Greek, a rich body of demotic texts shows the continued strength of native language and law. Many people lived in a bilingual world, using both Egyptian and Greek names and choosing between two legal systems. Greek law gradually spread, especially for contracts, but Egyptian legal practice remained strong and helped preserve a distinct identity. However, most papyri come from particular regions, above all the Fayum, and from certain periods, so they give a detailed but very uneven picture. The glittering life of Alexandria as a royal and cultural capital is only faintly visible in this material. The papyri mostly show the concerns of villages and provincial towns, reminding us that one region or social layer cannot stand for the whole kingdom. Into this landscape stepped Ptolemy, son of Lagos, who became satrap of Egypt in 323 BCE, and later King Ptolemy the First Soter. He inherited an efficient but harsh regime from Cleomenes of Naucratis, an Alexandrian official who had already squeezed Egypt with strict tax policies and temple confiscations. Rather than dismantle this system, Ptolemy kept its tight control over the agricultural population and the flow of revenue, adjusting it to his own purposes. Politically, he presented himself in two ways at once. To Egyptians and their priestly elite, as a legitimate pharaoh and heir to Alexander, generous at his accession and respectful of the gods. To the wider Greek world, as the most rightful guardian of Alexander's legacy. His boldest symbolic move was to seize Alexander's corpse on its way to Macedonia and divert it to Memphis, then later to entomb it in Alexandria. The royal mausoleum complex, the Sema, housed both Alexander and the Ptolemaic kings and made Alexandria a kind of sacred center of the Hellenistic world. In foreign affairs, Ptolemy acted cautiously but ambitiously. He intervened in Koile, Syria, supported Seleucus's return to Babylon, occupied parts of southern Asia Minor, and eventually took over the Aegean League of the Islanders. Egypt under him was never just an inward-looking river kingdom. It became a naval and imperial power. Ptolemy, the second Philadelphus, presided over a long, stable, and culturally brilliant reign. Alexandria, with its royal court, library, and museum, became the intellectual showpiece of the Greek world. At sea, Philadelphus initially expanded Ptolemaic influence. After Lysimachus's death, he gained Samos and other bases, and after the First Syrian War, he took territories in Asia Minor. Court poetry, such as that of Theocritus, celebrated him as Lord of the Seas, naming a vast arc of subject peoples from Syria and Phoenicia to Libya, Ethiopia, and the Aegean Islands. But his rule was not without strain. His half-brother Magus rebelled in Cyrene. He backed Greek states like Sparta against Macedon in the Cremonideian War and suffered serious naval defeats near Kos and Ephesos, probably losing control of parts of the island league. The Second Syrian War ended with Antiochus II of the Seleucids recovering Samos and coastal territories and cementing peace by marrying Philadelphos's daughter Berenike, a dynastic move that would later help ignite the Third Syrian War. That third war provided the great stage for Ptolemy, the third Euergetes, the benefactor, ruling 246 to 221 BCE. He launched ambitious campaigns into Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, though his lasting gains again lay mainly in Asia Minor and Samos. Ideologically, he presented himself as a victorious pharaoh who defeated foreign enemies and restored religious order at home, famously claiming to have brought back sacred objects that Persians had once taken from Egyptian temples. This story earned him his honorary title and appears in Egyptian-style royal inscriptions. Evidence from dedications and administrative records shows that Ptolemaic power in overseas territories reached down into practical matters like livestock and slave supervision, indicating a deeply exploitative but tightly organized imperial presence. Early in his reign, we hear of the first native uprising in Ptolemaic Egypt, quickly suppressed but a sign of underlying tensions. In Greek politics, Ptolemy III continued the dynasty's strategy of funding allies, supporting the Achaean League against Macedon and hosting the exiled Spartan king Cleomenes. Yet he avoided large, risky commitments once it became clear how formidable Macedonian kings remained. Ptolemy IV Philopator, 221 to 205 BCE, has often been cast as the king under whom everything fell apart, largely because Polybios paints him as weak, pleasure-loving, and badly advised by Sosibios and Agathocles. In this hostile version, his decision in 217 to recruit large numbers of native Egyptians for the first time backfired. They helped win the great victory over Antiochus III at Raphia, then supposedly became proud, sought their own leaders, and rebelled. Modern historians are more cautious. It is clear that the years after Raphia were turbulent and saw a serious native uprising in southern Egypt, remembered in texts like the Rosetta Stone. but the timing is uncertain. The revolt may have begun later, and overseas Ptolemaic power remained stronger for longer than Polybios suggests. The raffia levy did not automatically doom the dynasty, even if it did contribute to tensions inside Egypt. To understand why the Ptolemies pushed so hard abroad, we have to see their network of bases around the eastern Mediterranean. They controlled islands and ports: Thera, Samos, Kos, Cyprus, stations on the Greek mainland like Methana and Maronea, an enclave opposite Samothrace, and footholds in Asia Minor and Crete. Their core strategic triangle was Coeli Syria, Cyprus, and Cyrene, which formed a protective ring around Egypt. These territories supplied timber, metals, pitch, and extra grain that Egypt itself lacked or produced only in limited quantities, and they gave Egypt leverage against both Seleucid Syria and Macedonia. Polybios's summary, though biased, captures this logic. By holding key harbors and fortresses from Pamphylia to near the Hellespont, the early Ptolemies could pressure rivals by land and sea, and felt secure enough at home to devote energy to foreign wars. Syrian wars often broke out early in a king's reign, when a new ruler needed victories, booty, and land grants to prove his worth to soldiers and subjects. Over time, however, this external reach shrank. The loss of Cyprus and Cyrene in the 2nd and 1st centuries badly weakened the defensive system, even though Egypt remained a significant power down to the Roman conquest. Inside Egypt, the picture from the later 3rd and 2nd centuries is one of increasing instability, layered over a still functioning society. Ptolemy IV's reign ended with a major native revolt led by Harunophris in Thebes. After his murder and the lynching of his hated ministers, the child king Ptolemy V Epiphanes faced both foreign stripping away of Ptolemaic possessions and long-running uprisings in Upper Egypt. Antiochus III seized Coele-Syria in the 5th Syrian War. Rhodes began to replace Egypt as the leading naval power after the Peace of Apamea. Later, Ptolemy VI Philometor tried and failed to regain Coele-Syria, triggering Antiochus IV's invasion. Egypt was almost completely occupied until the famous Roman intervention in 168 forced Antiochus to withdraw. Rome increasingly used arbitration and support for one claimant or another to expand its influence, while native revolts, anachoresis, mass withdrawals of peasants from their land, and local violence kept flaring in the countryside. The later Ptolemies are remembered through a haze of scandal: assassinations, incestuous marriages, civil wars, and repeated uprisings, especially in the Thebaid. Ptolemy VIII. Euergetes II's brutal reign saw further revolts, and the last Egyptian to be proclaimed pharaoh, Harsiisis, followed by an amnesty decree in 118 that tried to wipe the slate clean with tax cancellations, pardons, and renewed privileges, a classic piece of royal propaganda. After his death, the dynasty fragmented. Kings such as Ptolemy, 9th Letharos, and Ptolemy 10th Alexander turned parts of their realms into diplomatic bargaining chips, leaving Cyrene and even Egypt itself to Rome in their wills, so that Roman politicians could claim a legal interest without immediate annexation. Roman pressure grew. Cyprus and Cyrene were eventually seized. Roman generals like Lucullus inspected Egypt's wealth, and the Alexandrian mob sometimes reacted violently to rulers seen as Roman puppets, as when they tore Ptolemy XI to pieces after he murdered Berenike III. Ptolemy XII. Naos Dionysos marks the final phase before Cleopatra VII. He ruled only with Roman backing, paid heavily for recognition, and saw Cyprus annexed, which fueled unrest in Alexandria and briefly cost him his throne. Reinstalled by Roman arms, he left Egypt more dependent on Rome than ever. His daughter Cleopatra VII inherited this fragile state in 51 BCE. Remarkably, she spoke Egyptian as well as Greek and maneuvered skillfully amid Roman civil wars. She ruled first with younger brothers, then with her son Caesarion, using alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony to try to restore Egypt's power and perhaps tilt the balance of the Roman world toward the east. After the defeat at Actium and Octavian's capture of Alexandria, Cleopatra chose suicide in 30 BCE. Egypt, which had served Rome for decades as a useful client and counterweight, rather than a direct enemy, now became a Roman province, outliving Macedonian and Seleucid monarchies, but finally losing its independence when it could be annexed without serious risk. Socially and institutionally, Ptolemaic Egypt differed from other Hellenistic kingdoms. Greeks and Macedonians formed a ruling settler class, but there were surprisingly few fully Greek-style cities. Old Naucratis survived, and some foundations bore royal names, yet only Ptolemais in Upper Egypt functioned as a true polis with council, assembly, and magistrates, still tightly bound to royal control through officials who were at once civic leaders and royal commanders. The greatest foundation was Alexandria, personally cited by Alexander for its superb harbors and central position between Mediterranean and Nile. It followed a grid plan with wide intersecting avenues, a huge royal quarter of interconnected palaces, the Pharos lighthouse commanding the harbor, and the Museion and library, making it the intellectual capital of the Greek world. Its population, perhaps 400,000 to 500,000 at its height, was a mix of Greeks, Egyptians, and a large Jewish community. Full city citizenship, though, was reserved to Greeks and Macedonians, organized into demes with their own council and assembly. From the early 3rd century onward, Alexandria was the political hub of the kingdom, while Memphis remained the main religious center. Together they symbolize the dual nature of Ptolemaic rule, a Greek royal court ruling from a new cosmopolitan metropolis layered onto an ancient Egyptian state and society that continued, adapted, and eventually passed into Roman hands. Outside Alexandria, the Ptolemies did not cover Egypt with new Greek cities in the same way the Seleucids did in Asia. They took over an already dense landscape of villages, canals, and roads in the Nile Valley and Delta, with ancient cities like Thebes, Memphis, and Sais that had served as royal capitals in earlier periods. The country was divided into provinces called nomes, which the Greeks called nomoi. Each nome was overseen by a strategos, essentially a provincial governor and military commander. In some areas, especially the Fayum, there were officials known as nomarchs, who took charge of irrigation and land reclamation. They were assisted by men known as miriaruroi, literally supervisors of 10,000 aruras of land, a very large area of fields. Beneath them were royal scribes and village officials. The village scribe, or village chief, recorded local business and often had an Egyptian name, but names alone do not always show ethnic identity. Many people used both a Greek and an Egyptian name and chose whichever fitted the context, especially in official work or religious life. In the later 3rd century, the administration became more layered with the creation of districts called toparchies, subdivisions of a nome governed by toparchs. Alongside the civil and military structure, the Ptolemies built a powerful financial hierarchy. At the top stood the chief finance minister, the Diadochi. Under him, each nome had a financial officer called the oikonomos, supported by local staff, tax collectors, and auditors. Through this system, the crown could direct the flow of taxes in money and kind, monitor agricultural production, and control key resources across the country. Greek and Macedonian settlers were spread widely through this system. Many of them did not live in big cities, but in villages and rural settlements. The pattern followed older Egyptian practice, where earlier pharaohs had already settled Greek mercenaries in the country. Under the Ptolemies, not only royal soldiers but also foreign prisoners of war, including Greeks, Jews, Idumeans, and others, were settled on the land. These settlers were granted plots called lots and were known as clerics. At first, their land rights were for life only. When a cavalryman died, for example, the crown would reclaim his allotment. Over time, however, these grants became hereditary. Families could pass them down to their children, and the clerics became a semi-permanent military class, bound to the king and available as reservists. Soldiers holding such lots did not pay normal rent, but they still owed certain taxes and military duties. Those who rented crown land without being part of the cleruchic system had to pay all regular charges on their fields. Cultural life in these cleruchic communities remained strongly Greek. We have, for instance, a list of winners from a festival held in 267 before Christ that copies the royal birthday festival at Alexandria. By imitating this celebration and preserving its memory in official lists, the settlers affirmed both their Greek identity and their loyalty to the king. Yet many did not personally farm their land. They leased it to Egyptian peasants and lived as absentee landlords in Alexandria or in regional capitals. Even so, they were often very involved in the management of estates, negotiating leases, loans, and labor. Documents give us vivid snapshots of this world. One contract from the mid-3rd century shows 3 men from a Greek family described as Macedonians of the Epigoni, renting a large block of land from a royal estate in return for seed and expenses, promising to pay rent after the harvest. Another example comes from the late 2nd century and concerns Dionysios, son of Kephalas, a man from the Hermopolite nome whose family had gradually become more Egyptian in everyday life, while still using Greek in official dealings. Dionysios and his female relatives repeatedly took out loans of money and grain from other wealthy soldiers and clerics. This does not prove that he was poor. In fact, he controlled extensive farmland leased from the crown and cultivated by others. It is likely he used borrowed resources as capital to lend again to local peasants at high interest, acting as a rural financier. In one letter to the local governor, he complains that an enemy named Admetos is interfering with his sowing at a critical moment. He begs the official to order the local police not to disturb him or his mother until he has finished planting, and he carefully argues that this will protect both his own interests and the king's revenue. What he does not mention in the letter is that he is already months late in repaying a loan to this same Admetos. By appealing to a recent royal decree that protected crown tenants from harassment during sowing, he tries to turn official rules to his advantage. There were also social differences inside the cleruchic class. Cavalry service, for example, was almost entirely in the hands of men with Greek names. One petition to the king, written in 218 before Christ, comes from a man called Pistos, son of Leontomenes, who describes himself as a Persian of the Epigon, but uses a Greek identity and serves in a Greek environment. He complains that a Thracian cavalry colonist named Aristocrates, who holds a sizable land allotment, has refused to pay him his wages after a military campaign. Pistos explains that he fulfilled his contract, went on campaign, and returned safely, yet is still owed 10 drachmas. He asks the king to order the local authorities to summon Aristocrates and force him to pay what is due. This small case reveals tensions within the privileged military class and shows how even men inside the system needed royal protection to enforce their rights. Above the settlers and career soldiers stood a class of wealthy Greeks in royal service. Many of them arrived in Egypt with little and rose to great power and fortune by serving the king. They received fine houses in Alexandria, estates in the countryside, and sometimes even the right to collect revenues from cities in Asia Minor. Their pay could come partly in the form of salaries, but also from whatever they could extract as intermediaries between the crown and the local population. One such figure was Cleon, a royal engineer who oversaw quarrying, construction, and irrigation works in the Fayum. Another famous case is Zenon, a Greek from Caria, whose personal papers were discovered in the 20th century at Philadelphia in the Fayum. His archive contains around 2,000 documents and gives an extraordinary view of daily administration. Zenon arrived in Egypt in the service of Ptolemy II around 261 before Christ. After a few years, he was put in charge of a vast estate of 10,000 auroras, roughly 2,500 hectares, granted by the king to the powerful finance minister Apollonios. Zenon's job was to manage this enormous property, deal with tenants and workers, and make sure profits flowed upwards. His career was exceptional, but he represents a broader pattern. Many Greeks saw Egypt as a land of opportunity. Not all of them became rich, but for those with the right connections and skills, Ptolemaic Egypt offered a chance to climb very high in a royal system that blended Greek ambition with Egyptian land and labor. At the higher levels of society in Ptolemaic Egypt, Greek speakers dominated almost everything. The royal court was thoroughly Greek in language and culture. Especially from the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphos onwards, we do not see Egyptians in the top ranks of government or in major military commands, at least in the surviving records. It is hard to prove direct racial hatred, but some sources show a clear sense of superiority. In one poem by Theocritos, set in Alexandria, 2 women from Syracuse gossip as they walk to the festival of Adonis. One of them praises King Ptolemy for stopping crime, and then makes a sharp remark about Egyptian-style tricks, calling the natives bundles of deceit. The lines are spoken by a snobbish Greek woman, not directly by the poet, and there is probably some humor at her expense, but the joke still relies on a stereotype that many listeners would recognize. We get a more down-to-earth picture from the papyri. In one famous letter, a camel driver writes to Zenon, a Greek estate manager, to complain about his treatment. He explains that he did everything asked of him with the camels, first for an agent named Crotos in Syria, and then later at Philadelphia, under another overseer called Iason. Both men, he says, refused to pay him his full salary. He describes going hungry, suffering in both summer and winter, and being offered cheap wine instead of proper pay. Then he gives the real reason he believes he is being cheated. They despise him because he is a barbarian, a non-Greek, and he cannot speak Greek. He begs Zenon to order them to pay what is owed so that he does not starve. Whether every detail is true or not, the complaint assumes that prejudice against non-Greeks is a valid argument, something his Greek superior will accept as a serious issue. It also shows that not speaking Greek could be a real handicap in dealing with officials. This section shows how Ptolemaic Egypt was both deeply mixed and deeply unequal. On the ground, relations between Greeks and Egyptians were complicated. We see open hostility in moments like the case of Ptolemaios, a Macedonian living under obligation in the Serapeon at Memphis, who claimed he was attacked because I am a Greek during a time of unrest and anti-Greek feeling. Yet documents from places like the Fayum also show Thracians, Jews, Persians, and others trading, intermarrying, and using Greek contracts while Egyptians used their own legal system in Demotic, so they simply vanish from Greek paperwork. In reality, there were many mixed marriages, often Greek men and Egyptian women, Egyptian families adopting Greek names, and local elites blending cultures. Some Egyptians rose quite high. Generals like Nectanebo, advisors like the priest Manathon, and scribes like Menches, who called himself a Greek born in this land, blur the line between ethnicity, status, and legal category. Military service was a major route upward. Egyptians with some Greek ties could serve in garrisons, gain land and privilege, and move closer to the Greek world. Over generations, families like that of the soldier Drighton show how Greek and Egyptian identities could merge and then drift back toward the Egyptian side. At the same time, the priesthood remained a powerful Egyptian force. Priests combined temple wealth, local leadership, and farming, and could channel village grievances into resistance when royal demands became too heavy. Overall, Greeks and Macedonians were a tiny but dominant minority, perhaps outnumbered 70-1, who controlled top offices, the court, and the cultural tone of Alexandria, while everyday life was filled with quiet contact, cooperation, and mounting tension, especially from the late 3rd century onward. Administratively, Egypt looks like a tightly controlled state full of paperwork, but the reality was messier. Long instruction letters to local finance officials lay out ideal duties in exhausting detail: inspect canals, keep irrigation working, encourage peasants, supervise harvests, check workshops and storehouses, watch soldiers, and behave morally. These texts are more like moral handbooks than realistic job logs. In practice, local officials were powerful, often exploitative, and central authorities constantly complained about abuses. The famous revenue laws of Ptolemy II, which regulate wine production and taxes, once led scholars to talk about a centrally planned economy, but they actually cover only parts of production and are mainly about securing predictable tax flows, with many exemptions and privileges for favored groups like soldier settlers. Sowing schedules, big estates like Apollonios in the Fayum, and endless correspondence show the same pattern. The state tried to maximize taxable output and prevent evasion, but peasants resisted, local officials improvised, and the center pushed rather than micromanaged. Royal monopolies in oil, salt, mines, papyrus, beer, and similar sectors were designed above all to feed the treasury, not to develop the economy. The Ptolemies needed grain, cash, and materials to pay armies, maintain fleets, and live as great kings. They fostered trade through harbors like Alexandria and Naucratis, taxed cargoes heavily, as we see in luxury shipment lists full of fine wine, honey, cheeses, fish, and wool, and used a closed coinage system with lighter silver to skim a profit on every currency exchange. None of this was guided by modern economic theory. It was hard fiscal pragmatism built on pharaonic traditions of tax collection and Nile transport, now sharpened and monetized. Finally, the decline of the kingdom looks less like sudden collapse and more like long, uneven strain. Complaints about taxes, irrigation, and abuses appear already under Ptolemy II. Wars like the Syrian conflicts and big estates created pressure, but did not destroy the agricultural base, which the Nile's floods kept renewing. Over time, heavy taxation and local conflicts pushed some peasants off their land, weakened revenue, and fed unrest, especially in distant Upper Egypt. 2nd century evidence points to neglected waterworks in some areas and more open resistance, but also to a population more willing to protest and exploit moments when central control faltered. Climate fluctuations and bad Nile years hurt, yet were not unique to this period. What really changed was the kingdom's reduced capacity to absorb shocks and the growing financial drain of Rome. The loss of Cyprus and Cyrene, huge bribes and gifts to Roman leaders, and direct Roman interference in dynastic politics. Revolts had many causes: ethnic resentment, fiscal hardship, ambitious leaders, memories of earlier foreign overthrows, and the visible collapse of other Hellenistic monarchies. The result is a mixed verdict. The Ptolemaic system was exploitative but resilient, lasted for centuries, and created a long-lived Greek-Egyptian hybrid society that only finally gave way when Rome was ready and able to take over. This passage explains how our view of Hellenistic Greek literature has changed and why it matters. For a long time, people dismissed the poets and writers of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE as pale imitations of the real classics of 5th and 4th century Athens, and imagined Alexandrian scholarship as nothing but dusty catalogues. Today, scholars see this as completely wrong. One reason we misunderstood the period is survival. The Library of Alexandria, which had gathered and copied enormous numbers of texts, was damaged and later destroyed, and many works vanished. Poets who were famous in their own time, like Philetus of Kos, now survive only in fragments, so we can't judge their importance only by how much we have left. To understand Hellenistic literature, we have to place it in its social setting. It was created and performed within elite circles shaped by royal courts, great libraries, and multi-ethnic cities like Alexandria and Pergamon. The same people often did philosophy, science, textual criticism, and poetry. Literature, in our sense, did not exist as a single Greek category, but as overlapping activities of an educated class. Writers and audiences were almost always drawn from privileged groups. As in earlier centuries, authors were not professional writers, but landowners, officials, military men, or scholars with patronage. Alexandria created a new environment of court poetry and scholarly production. Theocritus, for example, came from Sicily to Alexandria and wrote bucolic poems about herdsmen in an archizing Doric dialect, blending real song traditions with literary play for urban readers, nostalgic for an older Greek countryside. He also composed praise poetry like Idyll 17, glorifying Ptolemy II as a just, pious, powerful ruler, and urban scenes like Idyll 15 that show festivals and luxury in Alexandria, while subtly praising the royal couple. At the same time, kings built huge libraries and research institutions. The Library and Mouseion of Alexandria and the rival library at Pergamon allowed scholars such as Zenodotus, Callimachus, Apollonius of Rhodes, Eratosthenes, Aristophanes of Byzantium, and Aristarchus to collect, compare, and edit Greek texts. This was both intellectual work and a political act. By gathering and organizing all Greek writings, the Ptolemies could present themselves as guardians and owners of Greek culture, relocating its symbolic center from old city-states to their new capital. Hellenistic poetry and prose constantly balanced tradition and innovation. Poets looked back to Homer and classical models, but they used them in clever, self-aware ways that suited a world of courts and scholars. Callimachus of Cyrene is the best example. Working in the Alexandrian library, he compiled catalogs and wrote highly sophisticated poems like the Atia, which retells the origins of rituals and myths with wit, rare vocabulary, and precise local detail. His hymns imitate old forms, but add modern, questioning touches. New genres flourished, especially didactic poetry. Aratus wrote on constellations and weather, Nicander on poisons and cures, Eratosthenes on cosmology and chronology, blending science, myth, and literary craft for an elite that enjoyed technical knowledge and intertextual games. In this world, tradition was not rigid repetition, but a flexible pattern to be reshaped. Innovation itself became traditional, as long as it stayed within a shared cultural code educated Greeks understood. At the same time, some literature turned inward and highly specialized. Lycophron's Alexandria is a dense prophetic monologue by Cassandra, loaded with obscure myths, coded hints, and rare words, almost a puzzle text for very learned readers. Poets experimented with the written page through shape poems, acrostics, and intricate wordplay, showing their awareness of reading as a visual and intellectual pleasure. But Hellenistic writing was not all for ivory tower scholars. Herodotus' mimes give short, dramatic scenes from everyday life in a rough dialect, probably meant for performance by a single actor. Popular storytelling flourished in the evolving Alexander legends and in demotic Egyptian tales, which used Alexander or idealized pharaohs to explore themes of power, identity, and resistance across Greek and Egyptian audiences. Finally, epigram became a signature form. Short, polished poems in elegiac couplets that grew out of stone inscriptions and object labels into a refined medium for personal feelings, memory, and display. Overall, the passage shows that Hellenistic literature was varied, inventive, and deeply tied to its social world. Far from the lifeless imitation it was once thought to be. In the Hellenistic period, epigram becomes much more common than many other poetic forms. Thousands of examples survive in later anthologies and on stone. The most famous collection is the Garland of Meleager, a kind of poetic bouquet made up of epigrams by many different poets. At the same time, we have to be careful. Just because an epigram sounds personal does not mean it describes real events. Poets adopt fictional voices and personae, and they often play with traditional themes to show their skill. A poem that looks like a direct confession can in reality be a clever variation on a well-known motif. Asclepiades of Samos is one of the best-known Hellenistic epigram poets. He wrote many short pieces on love, wine, and pleasure. In one epigram, he jokes that wine is the true test of love, because a man who claims not to be in love betrays himself by drinking too many toasts and becoming visibly upset. In another poem on the same love story, Hedalus, a younger epigrammatist attached to Samos, makes the tone more erotic. He describes a girl who has been seduced with wine and lists the clothing she has left in front of Aphrodite as trophies of the night, such as sandals and loosened sashes. Whether these lovers were real people is not important. What matters is the imagined setting. probably a male drinking party where verses like this would be recited and appreciated for their wit and daring. Epigram also allowed poets to touch on subjects that would have been taboo in earlier public poetry. Asclepiades, for instance, has a piece about two women from Samos who supposedly prefer each other to men. The tone is playful and mocking, and we cannot tell whether it reflects real relationships or simply fantasies for a male audience. The key point is that such themes could now be talked about, hinted at, and preserved in written form, even if the social reality behind them is hard to reconstruct. Not all epigrams are erotic or playful. Some capture a moment of reflection or philosophical insight in a few lines. Callimachus gives a moving example in his epigram on Heraclitus of Halicarnassus, a fellow poet. He hears of his friend's death and remembers how often they talked long into the evening. Heraclitus is now long since dust, but his nightingales, meaning his poems, still live, and death can never seize them. In just a few lines, the poem expresses grief, friendship, and the idea that poetry can outlast the poet's life. This is personal in tone, but it is also a highly shaped literary statement. Because of passages like these, Hellenistic epigram is often used as proof that this age was more individualistic and inward-looking. Yet Greek poets had written about the self since at least the 7th century in the works of Archilochus and Sappho. What feels new is not the existence of personal expression, but its style, intimate details, emotional realism, and psychological nuance. These developments run parallel to Theocritus' careful portraits of shepherds and lovers, and to Apollonius's interest in the inner life of figures like Medea. However, it is risky to jump from new literary techniques to sweeping conclusions about a society of selfish individuals or a general mood of despair. Epic poetry also changes under these pressures. Earlier Greek epic set the standard for grandeur and heroic scale, but Callimachus openly criticized long, repetitive, heroic poems. He is famous for saying that a big book is a big evil, and that he hates the common road. His taste was for compact, polished, elusive works rather than bulky narratives. The one major surviving Hellenistic epic, the Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes, shows how the old form could be transformed rather than simply repeated. The poem retells the myth of Jason and the Argonauts, but blends traditional epic storytelling with learned references, detailed descriptions of strange lands, and a strong focus on character and emotion. The scenes in which Medea falls in love with Jason are especially striking. Apollonius pauses the action to show her restlessness, her racing heart, and her internal debate, using comparisons drawn from everyday domestic life. This psychological approach is new in epic and fits well with the wider Hellenistic interest in the inner world. Theocritus, too, explores emotional states in unexpected ways. In his second idyll, The Sorceress, a young woman named Simetha performs a love spell at night to bring back her unfaithful lover. As she burns herbs and turns her magic wheel, she swings between anger, longing, and despair. The poem combines magical ritual with a close look at her feelings, and it gives a rare voice to a female character describing her own passion and humiliation. At the same time, we must remember that Theocritus was a man writing for an elite court audience. His women are literary figures, not documentary portraits, though their presence suggests that readers and listeners were now more open to hearing about women's emotional lives and private spaces. Comedy also contributes to this shift towards domestic and personal themes. Menander's new comedy, written in Athens soon after Alexander, moves away from political satire and instead focuses on family dramas, love affairs, and household conflicts. Plots often include mistaken identities, lost children, and romantic misunderstandings that finally resolve into marriage and social harmony. Women in his plays speak more and appear in a wider range of situations than in earlier drama, yet they are still carefully shaped to fit moral and social expectations. In one scene from The Girl with Her Hair Cut Short, a wise older man tells a jealous soldier that the girl he lives with chose him freely and can also leave him if he behaves badly. At first sight, this conversation can suggest more freedom for women, but we must always remember that this is theater written by a male author for a festival audience, and that the story ends by restoring traditional order. Beyond high literature, there were also prose works on sex, seduction, and pleasure, often written by men, but presented as if women were giving advice. These so-called shameless writers described techniques of love-making and strategies for winning a partner. Philosophers criticized these texts, not because they mentioned forbidden acts, but because they encouraged excess and self-indulgence instead of moderation. Again, they tell us more about male fantasies and moral debates than about any simple sexual liberation. All these examples raise a larger question. Why do we see more of the personal and private brought into public art at this time? Part of the answer lies in the changing political world. In many places, especially under Hellenistic kings, politics was no longer something citizens debated in assembly. Citizens had less direct control over decisions of war and peace, and royal courts, not city councils, became centers of power. Drama and poetry no longer needed to carry open political argument in the way they had in classical Athens. Writers turned more often to the household, to love, to friendship, and to individual psychology, both because audiences were interested and because these topics offered a safer space for exploration. Some historians link this move inward to a sense of Greek exclusiveness and withdrawal, as if Greeks saw themselves as a small, threatened group and used literature to retreat into a private cultural world. Others argue the opposite, suggesting that the breakdown of the old city-state boundaries made Greek culture less aggressive and more open to blending with other traditions. It is likely that both tendencies existed in different places and times. What we can say is that Greek culture had never been completely shut off from others. For centuries, Greeks had lived alongside non-Greeks in Asia Minor, the Black Sea and Western colonies. Contact with Egyptians, Persians, Phoenicians, and many others was normal. Hellenistic literature continues this habit of interaction, even when it asserts a strong Greek identity. A good example is the way Greek writers describe foreign peoples. In earlier times, Herodotus sometimes presented Egypt as the total opposite of Greece. In the Hellenistic and early Roman periods, authors like Hecataeus of Abdera, Manetho, Berosus, and Megasthenes write large works about Egypt, Babylonia, and India. They draw on local traditions and documents, but they also translate foreign customs into Greek categories so that their readers can understand them. Hecataeus, for instance, compares Jewish laws and way of life to those of idealized Greek communities. Megasthenes describes Indian society using Greek philosophical concepts. This is not modern racism, but it is a form of cultural power. By describing others in Greek terms, these writers quietly place Greek ways of thinking at the center. Egyptian priests and scholars respond in their own way. Manetho writes a history of Egypt in Greek, giving the country a long, proud past that stretches far beyond the arrival of Alexander. Babylonian priests like Berossus produce similar accounts for Mesopotamia. These works show how deeply intertwined Greek and non-Greek intellectual worlds had become. At the same time, Greek poets still imagine military service under kings like Ptolemy as an attractive escape or opportunity. In one poem by Theocritus, a disappointed lover wonders about going to Egypt to fight as a mercenary, which reflects the real pull of the new kingdoms on restless young men. In this part of the story, we move into the world of Hellenistic historians and ask a different question. Not what happened, but why did these writers tell history the way they did? Almost all the historians who wrote in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ are lost today. Only Polybius survives in large pieces, and even his work is incomplete. Still, by looking at later authors who used them, we can see what kind of history they were creating and what role it played in their society. For educated readers, history mostly meant political and military narrative. Kings, generals, wars, and decisive battles. Already in the classical period, this style tended to focus on strong individuals who seemed to shape events. Writers like Xenophon produced works that mixed narrative and biography, and sometimes even autobiography. When monarchy returned to the Greek world after Alexander, this tendency became even stronger. Yet there is a paradox. The most powerful dynasties, such as the Ptolemies in Egypt or the Seleucid kings in Asia, ended up with the poorest surviving literary record. Their stories were often told only indirectly, through the eyes of others. Some of the most colorful historians of this age were independent city men rather than court writers. Durus of Samos, who lived around the time of the early successors, ruled his city as a local strongman on behalf of greater kings, and later became its historian. His Macedonian history covered events from the 4th century down to the fall of Lysimachus. Later compilers used him heavily, especially for their portraits of figures like Eumenes of Cardia, Demetrius the Besieger, and Pyrrhus of Epirus. Ancient critics complained that Durus loved scandal and dramatic stories that made Macedonian rulers look cruel, decadent, or ridiculous. Modern reconstructions suggest something more complex. He filled his work with myths, anecdotes, moral lessons, amazing stories, and even little explorations of words and sayings. Another major figure was Timaeus of Tauromenion in Sicily. He spent many years in Athens and wrote a long history of the Western Greek world, including the career of Agathocles of Syracuse, who had driven him into exile. Not surprisingly, his treatment of that tyrant is strongly hostile. Timaeus was quarrelsome and attacked other historians so often that he acquired a mocking nickname meaning the critic or the slanderer. Yet he was also careful with evidence, and probably the first Greek historian to build a consistent timeline using the 4-year Olympic cycle. He was also one of the earliest writers to pay serious attention to Rome. In small fragments, we see him explaining Roman house gods, dating the foundation of the city, and commenting on early coinage. He even joked that Alexander conquered Persia faster than the orator Isocrates took to finish his famous speech urging war against Persia, a sharp way to compare words and actions. Closer to home, in Athens, Philochorus continued the long tradition of local history. His work, usually called Attis, after a legendary princess, told the story of Attica from mythic times down to his own age, finishing in the years when Macedonian control and Ptolemaic influence clashed in Greece. Philochorus combined narrative with antiquarian research into old customs cults, and institutions, and is often described as one of the first truly scholarly historians. His public engagement also brought danger. He took sides during a war between Antigonus Gonatas and Ptolemaic supporters, and paid for his stance with his life. Another 3rd century historian, Philarchus, wrote a sweeping narrative from the death of Pyrrhus down to the fall of the Spartan king Cleomenes III. He drew much material from Duris, but gave it an even more emotional tone, especially when writing about the revolutionary Spartan kings Agis and Cleomenes. Polybius later attacked him for bias and excessive pathos, yet still used him as a source. Because Philarchus loved lively details, many of his fragments survive in later writers who collected stories about luxury and excess. From him, we get vivid scenes of Ptolemy II groaning with gout, while watching ordinary Egyptians eat simply by the Nile, or long descriptions of the extravagant dress and display at royal courts, and even stories about the legendary wealth and softness of the Italian city of Sybaris. None of these historians seem to have been official court employees, and that relative independence gave them freedom to praise, criticize, or mock rulers as they liked. Other historians, however, lived much closer to royal power. Alexander himself had taken a historian with him on campaign, a relative of Aristotle named Callisthenes, who was meant to record his deeds and spread the desired image of the king. When Callisthenes resisted Alexander's growing demand for divine honors, he was executed, a warning about the risks of being too honest near a monarch. In many royal households, historians also served as secretaries and archivists, responsible for keeping copies of treaties, letters, and orders. One famous story tells how Eumenes of Cardia, Alexander's former secretary, rebuilt the burnt contents of his office from duplicate copies preserved by satraps and generals. The archives of kings were precious sources. Some rulers, like Philip V of Macedon, destroyed them rather than let them fall into enemy hands, while later writers proudly claimed to have consulted the files in Alexandria. The greatest of these court historians was probably Hieronymus of Cardia. He worked first with Eumenes and then with several Antigonid kings, and even served as governor of Thebes on their behalf. Though he moved in royal circles, later authors describe him as calm and fair-minded. He reacted against the gossip and cruelty tales of writers like Doris, and his history of the wars after Alexander became one of the main sources for Diodorus, Plutarch, Arrian, and others. Some kings did not just sponsor historians, they wrote history themselves. Ptolemy I composed a narrative of Alexander's campaigns, which Arrian used centuries later, trusting it partly because he believed a king would be ashamed to lie about such things. Pyrrhus of Epirus and Ptolemy. The Eighth of Egypt also wrote their own accounts, drawing on their official archives to justify their policies and decisions. Other rulers hired intellectuals to produce learned histories that linked their dynasties with older traditions. Works by Hecataeus on Egypt, Berossus on Babylon, Manetho on Egyptian kings, and Megasthenes on India all emerged in these court environments. Beyond the great capitals, many Greek communities developed a taste for writing their own past. Inscriptions from cities like Samos, Priene, or Heraclea in the Black Sea region mention writers who composed local histories. In Athens, a series of historians continued the work of earlier authors, updating the story of Greece as it moved through the turbulent years after Alexander. In Sparta, Sosibios wrote on early history and on local festivals and customs. roads produced chroniclers whose names we glimpse in inscriptions that list temple dedications and past benefactors. Large stone monuments like the Parian marble or the Lindian Chronicle show how cities proudly displayed lists of events, rulers, and victories, setting their local story into wider Greek time. In the East, Babylonian scribes adjusted their own ancient chronicle traditions to include Alexander and the Seleucid rulers, while Jewish scholars began to compose Greek prose on their own history and identity. A famous example is the story that tells how the Law of Moses was translated into Greek for the Ptolemaic court by 72 scholars. Other works, such as the books of the Maccabees, mix historical narrative with theology, resistance, and political reflection. Some Jewish thinkers even argued that Greek philosophers had borrowed their best ideas from Moses, trying to build a bridge between Hebrew and Greek ways of thinking. One particularly striking episode comes from the correspondence between Jewish leaders and Sparta. A Jewish high priest named Jonathan sent envoys to Rome and Sparta to renew friendship treaties. In his letter to the Spartans, he reminded them that an earlier king of Sparta had claimed that Spartans and Jews were related and descended from the same ancestor, Abraham. He wrote that the Jews prayed for the Spartans at their festivals and thanked them for their past support. The reply from Sparta repeated the claim of kinship and declared that what belongs to you is ours, and what belongs to us is yours. Later, after Jonathan's death, the Spartans wrote again to his successor Simon to confirm the bond. These stories show how historical writing and diplomatic myth blended together to create a shared narrative useful for both sides. In this world, Greek elites, especially in self-governing cities and federal leagues, had strong motives to read and write history. They wanted to see their community as playing a role in the wider story of the Mediterranean, just as earlier Athenians had done. They were proud of their institutions and traditions and eager to place local events into larger patterns. This helps explain the explosion of local histories and antiquarian studies, as well as the growth of works on geography that map cities, regions, and peoples. At the same time, history remained closely tied to war. For most ancient readers, battles and campaigns were not optional topics. They were the skeleton of history itself. A battle narrative gave structure and meaning to events. Writers like Polybius carefully described the deployment of forces, the movements of troops, and the turning points in clashes like Seleucia or Raphia, and then added analysis to show why the result made sense. Fortune and chance still played a role, but tactics, leadership, and resources were meant to explain why one side won and the other lost. Some of the most openly partisan history came from practicing politicians. Aratus of Sicyon, a leading general of the Achaean League in the 3rd century, wrote memoirs defending his own actions and policies. Polybius used them as his main source for the period, even when he felt the need to correct or supplement them. Both men were strongly attached to the interests of the Achaean League and sharply critical of Spartan kings like Cleomenes III. Their works show how independent Greek elites could produce serious analytical history while still being deeply involved in current struggles. Yet even where royal patronage was absent, bias and personal agendas remained. City pride, political rivalry, and personal grudges shaped many narratives, just as later educational needs and literary tastes decided which historians would survive. Why then have so many Hellenistic historians disappeared? The answer is not as simple as saying they wrote in bad style. A large part of the loss is due to the general fragility of ancient books. Volumes had to be copied by hand to survive, and any text that fell out of use could vanish within a few generations. The very length of many historical works made them vulnerable. Some authors produced multi-volume histories filled with speeches and long digressions. Later readers complained that such books were heavy-going, especially when the author piled up rhetorical set pieces. Abridged versions and summaries became popular, and these shorter guides often replaced the full originals in libraries and private collections. Some later writers noted that histories of the Hellenistic kings were already hard to find or no longer read by their time. Meanwhile, a small group of classical authors, such as Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Polybius, became school texts. Their works were copied, studied, and imitated, which greatly increased their chances of survival. This process of canonization is sometimes called classicism, and it acted like a filter. A few chosen voices were preserved, while many others gradually disappeared. When we talk about Greek literature, we also have to ask a basic question. Who was actually reading these texts, and where were they? In every Greek society, only a small part of the population could really read and write well, and an even smaller group had enough free time to sit and enjoy what we call literary works. But there were some clear centers of reading and writing. Cities like Athens, Alexandria, and Pergamon were major hubs of education, libraries, and book culture. In many old Greek cities, there was a fairly wide educated group. When ancient writers mention schools, even in modest towns, they talk about classes with 100 or more boys. In the new Greek settlements of Egypt and the Seleucid Empire, the picture is a bit different. There, teaching focused mainly on older, classic authors like Homer, the great Athenian tragedians, and the comedies of the later period. Among newer works, only some Alexandrian poems seem to have been used in teaching. That suggests that Greek education in these areas was mostly about passing on an established Greek cultural core, not constantly updating it with every new fashion. Beyond the old Greek heartlands, the evidence is thin but telling. At Ai-Khanum, a Greek city in modern Afghanistan, archaeologists found the faint imprint of a papyrus with Greek philosophical writing pressed into the soil, a small sign that someone had once been reading serious texts there. In the same city, on a wall in a Greek-style building, someone carved the old Delphic moral maxims that had been brought from Greece by a philosopher named Clearchos. In Mesopotamia, the work of Berossus, a Babylonian writing in Greek, shows there was a literate circle interested in blending Greek and local traditions, even if his style may not have impressed all readers. Generally, wherever there were Greek-style towns and military settlements, there were also gymnasia, training centers that combined physical exercise with lessons in language, poetry, and culture. In these places, young men would learn Homer and other classic texts and absorb the identity of Greek paideia. It is less clear how far the more experimental new literature of the Hellenistic age reached into these frontier societies. It probably circulated among small, mobile elites rather than through the whole population. Modern scholars disagree about how open or closed this Greek culture was in the Eastern kingdoms. Some earlier researchers argued that Greek culture in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire stayed almost completely separate from native traditions. Others imagined a very broad and deep wave of Hellenization sweeping over non-Greek peoples. A more balanced view suggests something in between. There was real contact and exchange between Greek and non-Greek elites, and the kings sometimes actively promoted Greek education among local notables. At the same time, for Greeks living in the East, and for non-Greeks who entered this world, Greek education was mainly about preserving a sense of Greekness. It was not really about creating a new mixed culture, but about defending and reproducing one particular identity. Only in special places, above all Alexandria, did Greek culture start to generate new forms and new genres in response to the new environments of empire, royal patronage, and huge multicultural cities. Even there, however, cultural exchange was always a two-way process. Greek authors did not simply project their own world outwards. They were also reacting to and reshaping ideas and traditions from Egypt, the Near East, and beyond. So the social role of Greek literature is complicated. On one level, it was clearly a badge of elite status. Knowing the right poets and philosophers, being able to quote them, and to enjoy subtle allusions, marked you out as part of a particular social group. Yet there are also hints that some genres, like popular histories of Alexander or certain romances and epigrams, reached a broader public through readings, performances, and retellings. In literary texts, non-Greeks could be used to sharpen Greek identity, sometimes by emphasizing difference and distance, sometimes by absorbing foreign figures into a Greek frame of reference. Writers combined very personal themes with public concerns, and they relied on forms of patronage that in some ways resembled those of early archaic Greece, when poets depended on kings, nobles, or city festivals. Authors constantly engaged with tradition, but in a very Greek way. They did so by innovating, by playing with form, experimenting with voice, and exploring new ways of representing character, emotion, and the inner life. Historians tried both to make sense of a new, fragmented power system and to keep alive the memory and pride of individual cities and leagues. Across all these areas, the common thread is the sheer energy of reproduction and reworking. Texts copied, recited, answered, parodied, and reused, showing how central reading and performance remained for Greek elites as they thought about themselves and their place in a much larger world. To see how all this fits into a wider setting, it helps to turn to the largest of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Seleucid Empire. Unlike Macedonia or Egypt, which each centered on a relatively compact region and a dominant ethnic group, the Seleucid realm stretched across many climates, landscapes, and cultures from Western Asia Minor to the borders of India. It created more opportunities than any other kingdom for Greeks and non-Greeks to meet, mix, and clash, especially through city foundations and military colonies. But its very size brought serious problems of control. The kings had to cope with long distances, difficult terrain, powerful local traditions, and constant pressure from rival powers like Egypt and later Rome. Much of their system rested on older foundations. For 2 centuries before Alexander, the Persian Empire had already picked out the richest and most strategic zones, especially Asia Minor and the great river valleys, and had built networks of roads, tax systems, and garrisons. Alexander conquered this framework rather than destroying it, and the Seleucid kings inherited and modified it. When we study this empire, we rely on a different mix of sources than for Egypt. In the western regions, especially Asia Minor and Syria, we have many Greek inscriptions recording royal letters, decrees, city honors, and contracts. Further east, however, Greek texts become rarer, and we have to use materials written in Babylonian and other local languages. Some of the most important are the astronomical diaries from Babylon, along with lists of kings, and other official records baked into clay tablets. Archaeology has often focused on big cities and spectacular finds, but detailed surveys of whole regions are still limited, so our picture of the countryside and its changes is incomplete. Unlike Egypt, the Seleucid Empire has not given us papyri, because the climate and soils do not preserve them. For parts of the Far Eastern territories, such as Bactria and India, we often depend almost entirely on coinage and a few scattered references in later authors. The result is a patchy but fascinating mosaic. Geographically, the Seleucid Empire can roughly be divided into 4 main zones. Western Asia Minor is a broad upland plateau cut by rivers and fringed by coastal plains along the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. It had long been dotted with Greek cities along the coast, places like Ephesus, Miletus, and Halicarnassus, as well as inland centers such as Sardis in Lydia. These regions were known for wine, figs, livestock, and wool, and some Greek cities controlled rural populations that were not fully Greek in language or lifestyle. Further inland, regions like Phrygia and Pamphylia were less urban and less clearly Hellenized, and some northern areas, such as Pontus and Commagene, were never tightly held by the Seleucids. Politically, Western Asia Minor was fragmented and hard to rule from the east. Although the kings wanted to keep its rich cities and resources, they had to deal with strong local traditions of city independence and constant interference from Egypt and Macedonia. The result was a region that shifted repeatedly between different overlords. The second major zone is the Fertile Crescent, stretching from the coasts of Syria and Phoenicia through inland Syria and down into Mesopotamia and Babylonia. This belt of land, which includes modern Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Jordan, and Iraq, contained some of the richest farmland and the highest density of cities in the ancient world. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was a low-lying plain whose fertility depended on careful control of water through canals and embankments. Ancient authors describe astonishing harvests of barley and a palm economy that produced food, drink, oil, and even fuel for metalworkers and fodder for animals. Royal planners like Alexander and the Seleucid kings invested heavily in irrigation projects and tried to direct river waters to protect key areas. One famous example is Alexander's work on canals that linked the Euphrates with artificial lakes and new settlements. Near Babylon, Seleucus founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, which grew to rival and surpass Old Babylon in size and importance. Its location at the junction of major land and river routes made it a key node for trade and administration. Syria and the Levant added their own wealth. The mountains of Lebanon supplied timber and pitch for shipbuilding, essential for any kingdom that wanted a strong navy. Antioch on the Orontes, one of the main Seleucid capitals, stood at the center of a fertile river valley and controlled routes from the Mediterranean into Inner Asia. Nearby, royal estates and horse studs pastured thousands of animals and supported a large military and administrative staff. Cities like Damascus enjoyed plentiful water from rivers and springs. Palestine and Transjordan offered arable land, grazing, fruit trees, dates, and special products like balsam and bitumen from the Dead Sea. At the same time, some neighboring desert zones could not be ruled directly, so the kings maintained looser relationships with Arab tribes through gift exchange and diplomacy. The Phoenician ports, especially Tyre and Sidon, enriched the kingdom through trade and valuable goods like purple dye, but were also attractive targets for rivals. This is why Egypt and the Seleucid kings fought so often over coastal Syria. Now we move into one of the most dramatic parts of the Seleucid world, the long belt of mountains and high plateau that stretches from southern Anatolia all the way to Central Asia and the borders of India. This region begins in rough Cilicia, Lycaonia and Commagene in today's Turkey, runs through Pontus and the old lands of Armenia and Atropatene, and then continues into the Zagros Mountains and inner Iran. It is a huge natural barrier. On one side lie the lands that look towards the Mediterranean. On the other side are the routes that lead to India, China, and the great steppe zones of Central Asia. Iran itself is a high basin, mostly between about 500 and 1,500 meters above sea level, surrounded by mountains on almost all sides. To the north are Elburz and Kopet Dag. To the west and southwest, the steep wall of the Zagros, and to the far east, the western arms of the Himalayan and Karakoram systems. Iran also touches two seas, the Caspian in the north and the warm waters of the Gulf in the south. Inside this great arc, we find a patchwork of smaller regions, each with its own landscape and resources. Commagene, for example, was described in antiquity as a small land with its royal seat at Samosata. The surrounding territory was limited in size, but very fertile and rich in fruit trees. Nearby Cappadocia was known for its orchards, for silver mines, and for deposits of red pigment used as ruddle. North along the Black Sea coast, Pontus had valuable timber, fertile valleys around towns like Amasya, and mines of silver, iron, and other minerals, while its coastal cities lived from fishing. Armenia offered yet another mix: fruit trees and cultivated land in the valleys, silver and iron in the mountains, and famous cavalry horses, but also very harsh winters and extremely high peaks such as Mount Ararat. Heavy snow and difficult passes could swallow caravans, so survival there demanded local skills and equipment. Even so, Armenia lay within reach of Mesopotamia through a relatively low route to the upper Euphrates, so the Seleucid kings could not simply ignore it. In practice, Armenia was divided between two Iranian dynasties who accepted a loose dependence on the Seleucids. Only occasionally did a Seleucid king intervene directly and replace one line of rulers with another. To the east lay Atropatene, roughly modern northwest Iran and Azerbaijan on the southwest shore of the Caspian Sea. It remained semi-independent under Atropates and his descendants, who ruled a mountainous but partly well-watered land that benefited from rain coming off the Caspian. Deeper inside Iran, we find a landscape of hills, high plains, and severe continental climate, but also many rivers fed by winter snow. Persian aristocrats had long been famous for their gardens and hunting parks filled with fruit trees and game. They grew fodder crops such as alfalfa to feed horses, raised large herds of cattle, and cultivated fertile valleys, some of which are still productive today. There were old royal centers like Ecbatana, Susa, Pasargadae, and Persepolis, as well as new Seleucid foundations such as Laodicea. Inner Iran was not one of the richest parts of the empire, and its many different basins were not tightly connected to each other. Yet because the territory was so large and relatively well-peopled, it could, in theory, yield substantial tribute and supply many soldiers. The Seleucids ruled some areas directly through satraps, especially in Media, Susiana, and Persis, but in more rugged zones they relied heavily on local noble families. These nobles collected taxes, raised troops, and kept order in exchange for recognition, gifts, and a degree of autonomy. Beyond the Elburz Mountains to the northeast lay Hyrcania on the Caspian shore. a hilly region with abundant rainfall and small settlements. Further east again, we come to a compact group of lowland satrapies at the edge of Central Asia. Parthia and Margiana in modern Turkmenistan and northeastern Iran, and Araya covering northeastern Iran and northwest Afghanistan. Hyrcania never seems to have been a major focus of Seleucid town foundations. Parthia started out as a small vassal satrapy that only slowly grew into a major power later. Araya was fertile where rivers could be diverted for irrigation, although it endured sharp contrasts between very hot summers and cold winters. Margiana was a true oasis region along the Middle Oxus. Its fertility impressed Antiochus I so much that he refounded Alexander's city there as a new Antioch. These eastern satrapies sat astride important caravan roads that linked the Seleucid world with the Far East, so they generated wealth not only from agriculture but also from long-distance trade in luxury goods. Even further north, Sogdiana stretched around Marakanda, the later Samarkand. It combined mountains, desert, and a chain of green oases watered by rivers running down from the highlands. Together with Bactria and Margiana, Sogdiana made up what one historian has called the Babylonia of the East, a zone of irrigated fields, orchards, and gardens that could support dense settlement and busy towns. Seleucid interest here is visible in the network of cities and smaller military posts. Alexander had founded Alexandria Eschate, the furthest Alexandria, on the Jaxartes River. Antiochus I refounded it as an Antioch, and there is evidence for Greek works at Marakanda and other sites. This shows that the kings did not view these remote lands as expendable fringes, but as valuable provinces worth investment and defense. South of these northern satrapies, we reach the eastern highlands, Drangiana, Arachosia, Bactria, and Carmania. Drangiana, in what is now east-central Iran and southern Afghanistan, was watered by the Helmand River and known for its fertility and for tin deposits. It probably stayed under Seleucid control through most of the 3rd century. Arachosia, further east, was partly desert, but also had irrigated zones. Its eastern section was given up by Seleucus to the Indian ruler Chandragupta, and later taken over by the Greco-Bactrian kings as they expanded south. Carmania, in southeastern Iran, combined fertile valleys with rich mineral resources, including gold, silver, copper, and salt, and produced vines. Bactria itself, in northeastern Afghanistan, became famous as one of the richest lands in the east. Its wealth came from irrigated farming along the rivers of the Oxus Basin, from excellent cavalry, and from its role as a crossroads for caravan trade. Silver from the Hindu Kush probably added to this prosperity. Ancient authors called it the ornament of all eastern Iran, and some claimed it had 1,000 cities. These were likely a mixture of true cities and smaller fortified towns, but the general picture is clear. Bactria was densely settled and heavily developed by ancient standards. Strategically, it was also crucial because it bordered the steppe world to the north. Like the earlier Persian kings, the Seleucids, and then the Greco-Bactrians fortified the Jaxartes frontier and built garrisons there. Seleucus sent commanders such as Demodamas beyond the Jaxartes to push back nomad groups and show royal strength, and another officer, Patrocles, explored the Caspian region and reported on its geography. Politically, Bactria eventually slipped out of direct Seleucid control. The seeds of this break were already present. Not long after Alexander's death, Greek settlers in the upper satrapies, far from their homeland, were described as missing Greek education and lifestyle. While Alexander lived, they obeyed out of fear, but after his death, they tried to revolt under their own general. The Macedonian leadership responded brutally, and many of these men were killed. Decades later, in the mid-3rd century, the local governor Diadochi took advantage of distance and local strength to declare himself king. Even so, it would be wrong to see this as a simple result of Seleucid neglect. The foundations, expeditions, and garrisons in Bactria and Sogdiana show that the central court saw this eastern region as valuable and fought hard, for a time, to keep it. Beyond these satrapies lay the furthest eastern lands once touched by Alexander. Gandhara, along with Sind, the harsh plateau of Gedrosia in Baluchistan, and the urban centers of Taxila and Pushkalavati in the Indus Valley. Seleucus I ceded these areas to Chandragupta, founder of the Mauryan Empire. Under his successors, especially the famous Ashoka, the Mauryan state expanded to cover almost all the Indian subcontinent except the far south, and included western Arachosia. Ashoka converted to Buddhism and presented himself as a moral ruler. His messages were carved on rocks and pillars across his lands in local scripts and languages. In one bilingual inscription from Kandahar, written in both Greek and Aramaic, he announced that since his 10th year of rule, he had tried to spread piety, limit the killing of animals, restrain excess, and encourage obedience to parents and elders. This shows how far Greek language and audiences extended, and how Indian and Greek worlds touched at the edge of the Seleucid sphere. Trade remained active between the Seleucid lands and India in hardwoods, spices, gemstones, and other luxuries, and the Seleucid kings clearly encouraged it for both prestige and revenue. Envoys such as Megasthenes traveled to Indian courts and wrote ethnographic accounts, adding India to the mental map of Greek readers. Later, it was no longer the Seleucids, but the Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek kings who pushed deeper into northwest India. Demetrius and Menander, known in Indian sources as Melinda, are the best known of these rulers. Menander, in particular, became a legendary figure in Buddhist tradition, remembered as a king who discussed doctrine with a monk and eventually accepted the Buddhist path. Yet after his time, the political picture in the Far East became very fragmented. Dozens of kings are known only from coins, and several dynasties seem to have overlapped and competed. New nomad groups arriving from deeper in Central Asia, the Yuezhi, the Saka, and the Scytho-Parthians, pressed into Bactria, Drangiana, and the neighboring regions. By around the middle of the 1st century before Christ, Greek power in this whole zone had been broken, and the old eastern provinces were divided among these new peoples. If we step back from the details, we can see that the entire eastern half of the Seleucid world was a mosaic of mountains, deserts, river oases, and high plateau. Not a single natural unit like the Nile Valley or Mesopotamia. Large parts of it could never support very dense populations and were difficult to bind into a single political structure for long. Control often rested on alliances with local elites, with tribal leaders, or with semi-independent dynasties, and on a network of fortified cities and military colonies rather than on one continuous administrative grid. Communications were slow, and loyalty at the edges could never be taken for granted. Yet the Seleucid kings did not begin from nothing. They inherited from the Achaemenid Persians a system of roads, satrapies, and power relations that had worked, more or less, for 2 centuries. When we study their empire, it may be more realistic to start from the assumption that they often managed this complex world successfully, and only speak of decline when we see clear evidence of collapse, rather than treating the whole story as one long failure from the outset. Seleucus I, who ruled from 305 to 281 BC, first appears as the man appointed to govern Babylonia after the death of Alexander. He was driven out by Antigonus, one of the most powerful of Alexander's generals, but later returned in 312 BC with the military help of Ptolemy in Egypt. From that moment on, Seleucus could not just sit still if he wanted a large kingdom. He had not been given control of all the eastern lands, so every new province had to be earned in war. He fought Antigonus and his officers, including local strongmen such as Nicanor in Media, a region in northwestern Iran. By defeating them, Seleucus took Media, Susiana, and nearby rich territories, probably including the Persian homeland. These were lands that produced heavy tribute and gave him both money and prestige. After these victories, he wrote proudly to Ptolemy and his other allies, already presenting himself as a man with the status of a king. The message was clear. Military success and royal dignity were closely linked. By the time of the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, or shortly afterwards, Seleucus controlled almost all the lands in the east that had once belonged to the Persian Empire and had been conquered by Alexander. Before Ipsus, he had also marched from Bactria into northwestern India to fight Chandragupta, the founder of the Mauryan Empire. Here, Seleucus could claim that he was defending Alexander's legacy, but instead of endless war, he chose a compromise. He made a treaty, giving up some eastern territory in exchange for a large number of war elephants. These animals would later play an important role in his battles in the west. After Ipsus, Seleucus was also given the rich region of Syria and Phoenicia by agreement, though he soon lost parts of it to Ptolemy. He quickly recovered by taking northern Syria, northern Mesopotamia, Armenia, and southern Cappadocia, and he asserted his authority over Commagene. At this point, he ruled almost everything Alexander had held outside mainland Greece, apart from Egypt and some parts of Asia Minor. In effect, he controlled most of the old Persian Empire with its network of tribute-paying provinces. At the end of the 280s, BC Seleucus defeated Lysimachus at the Battle of Corupedium and then marched into Macedonia itself. Babylonian records say he wanted to take back Macedonia as his own land, while Greek writers simply speak of his longing to see his homeland again. This moment shows that, although the successors often accepted the division of Alexander's empire in practice, deep inside they still dreamed of reunifying it when the chance came. Seleucus, however, was assassinated soon after entering Europe. His death did not cause a collapse, because his son Antiochus I had already been made co-ruler since 292 BC. This shared rule was not a sign of weakness or a formal division of the kingdom. It was a clever way to show dynastic stability and avoid the chaos that had followed Alexander's death. To underline this cooperation, Seleucus even arranged for his wife Stratonice to marry Antiochus, turning a potential family drama into a symbol of unity. When Seleucus died, Antiochus I was in the far eastern parts of the empire, and some regions rose in revolt, including several cities in Syria, very likely the new foundations of Seleucus himself. Ptolemy in Egypt may have encouraged this unrest, yet there is little clear evidence that non-Greek populations rebelled on a large scale. Antiochus's campaigns in the following years are best seen as a tour of reassertion, a way of reminding cities and satraps that they still owed loyalty to the house of Seleucus, rather than a desperate attempt to crush a total breakdown. By around 270 BC, Antiochus had also defeated invading Gauls in Asia Minor, which greatly increased his prestige there. This helped him keep Cappadocia loyal under a royal general and maintain good relations with Philetaerus, the ruler of Pergamon, who had once served Lysimachus. Antiochus probably fought Ptolemy II in what later writers call the First Syrian War. Ptolemy managed to seize some former territories of Lysimachus in western Asia Minor and the Aegean. Antiochus may even have planned to overthrow Ptolemy and support his brother Magas, the ruler of Cyrene, as a new king of Egypt. Whether or not that plan was real, nothing came of it. After a decade of action, however, Antiochus had secured his dominions from Asia Minor and Syria all the way to the east. One of the most lasting achievements of Seleucus I and Antiochus I was their energetic program of city building, especially in Syria and Iran. They founded strong new cities that were both military bases and economic centers. In Syria, Seleucus created a famous group of 4 cities known as the Tetrapolis: Antioch on the Orontes, Seleucia in Pieria on the coast, Apamea inland on the Orontes, and Laodicea on the sea. Antioch became the main royal residence and almost rivaled Alexandria in Egypt, and Seleucia on the Tigris in size and power. Near Antioch lay the beautiful suburb of Daphne, with groves, springs, and a famous sanctuary of Apollo and Artemis. Seleucia in Pieria guarded the coast with strong fortifications. Laodicea enjoyed fertile vineyards on the slopes above it and exported wine, especially to Alexandria. Apamea sat in a strong position on a hill surrounded by a river, a lake, and marshes, and the surrounding plains and meadows supported huge numbers of horses and cattle. Together, these cities formed a new backbone for Seleucid rule in Syria, combining trade, resources, and military strength. Like his father, Antiochus I used co-regency to plan the succession, but this time it ended badly. He made his son Seleucus joint ruler in 279 BC, then had him executed in the early 260s for reasons that are not fully clear. His other son, the future Antiochus II, then became heir. By now, Syria had clearly become the main contact zone and battlefield between the Seleucid Empire and Ptolemaic Egypt. At the same time, half a century of experience in conquest, administration, and city building had given the Seleucid court a clearer sense of how to manage their wide-flung dominions. Antiochus II, who ruled from 261 to 246 BC, and his son Seleucus II, ruling from 246 to 226 BC, often appear in modern accounts as kings presiding over decline, especially in the east. Some writers argue that the Iranian provinces were becoming less central to the political and economic unity of the empire, which was increasingly focused on Syria and Mesopotamia. This view may be exaggerated. Bactria did move towards independence around this time, but for many regions in the east, we simply have no detailed evidence. In the absence of clear proof to the contrary, it makes sense to assume that Seleucid control continued in much of the east. The fact that no Seleucid king is known to have visited Iran between the 260s and about 230 BC might actually show that things were running smoothly rather than that the east was being abandoned. Early in his reign, Antiochus II fought the Second Syrian War against Ptolemy II. Ptolemy wanted more territory in Asia Minor and the Aegean, but instead he lost several Greek cities in Ionia, some islands like Samos, and strips of the southern coast to Antiochus. The peace that followed was sealed with a marriage arrangement. Antiochus divorced his first wife, Laodice, and married Ptolemy's daughter Berenice. This looked like a diplomatic triumph for the Seleucids. But when both kings died in 246 BC, their settlement collapsed into chaos. In the Third Syrian War, also known as the Laodicean War, Ptolemy III invaded Asia Minor to support the claim of Berenice's son to the Seleucid throne. She and her child were murdered, and the crown went instead to Seleucus II, Antiochus's son by Laodice. Ptolemy's army advanced as far as Babylon, but in the long run, he only kept a limited number of coastal and island strongholds. Seleucus II copied the practice of early co-regency. He made his brother, Antiochus, nicknamed Hierax, joint ruler. This decision backfired and soon turned into open war between the brothers. In Asia Minor, Attalus I of Pergamon also entered the scene. Antiochus Hierax tried to set himself up as king there, and after a series of campaigns, Attalus defeated him and took control of large parts of the region by 227 BC. From the point of view of the wider empire, though, this loss, while serious, did not destroy the Seleucid heartlands. What mattered more was the struggle along the northeastern frontier, where Seleucus II found himself fighting the Parthians around 230 to 227 BC, possibly also trying to keep influence in Bactria. Seleucus II died relatively young. His son Seleucus III ruled only briefly from 226 to 223 BC and was assassinated while campaigning against Attalus. The next king, Antiochus III, came to the throne at about 19 or 20 years old. He would become the most energetic and successful Seleucid king since the founder. His early years were turbulent. In 221 BC, new young kings also took power in Egypt and Macedonia, Ptolemy IV and Philip V, and their overlapping ambitions would soon reshape the political map of the Eastern Mediterranean, especially after Rome began to intervene. Antiochus III first had to deal with threats inside his own realm. When Seleucus III died, the army proclaimed a man called Achaeus, a grandson of Seleucus I, as king. Achaeus refused the crown, accepted Antiochus as legitimate king, and continued the war in Asia Minor. At court, however, Antiochus's chief minister Hermias dominated the young ruler. In 222 BC, Molon, governor of the eastern satrapies, rebelled, reportedly because he feared Hermias's influence. Molon invaded the western parts of the empire before being defeated. Hermias himself was later killed, and Achaeus eventually changed his mind and declared himself king in Asia Minor. For a while, Antiochus tolerated this, then moved decisively. In 213 BC, Achaeus was captured, mutilated, and impaled, the same harsh punishment that Persian kings once gave to traitors. In the west, Antiochus III invaded Egypt's Asian possessions, but was defeated at the Battle of Raphia. After that setback, he turned north, taking direct control of Commagene and northern Armenia, and forcing the ruler of southern Armenia to pay overdue tribute. From there, he continued east on a long campaign that lasted from 212 to about 205 or 204 BC. Later generations called this journey his anabasis, his march into the interior. During these years, he re-established Seleucid authority across the eastern satrapies. He fought the Parthians in northeastern Media, not to destroy them completely, but to stop their raids and remind them of their subordinate status. Parthian coins of this time still show that their kings acknowledged Seleucid overlordship. Antiochus also attacked Euthydemus, king of Bactria, as a rebel, but after a long struggle, he accepted him as a legitimate king. According to Polybius, Euthydemus argued that both realms needed to stay strong to defend themselves from large numbers of nomads living beyond their borders. This kind of picture of dangerous barbarian horse peoples pressing in from the steppes was a familiar way for Greek writers to describe the non-Greek world. Whether completely accurate or not, it certainly worked as a political argument. In the end, Antiochus confirmed Euthydemus as king, turning him into a loyal partner rather than a direct subject. Antiochus also renewed contacts with India and made agreements with Arab traders from Gera on the Gulf. This long eastern expedition should not be seen as a last, desperate attempt to rebuild a shattered empire. It was more like a royal inspection tour in the traditional style of Near Eastern empires. A planned journey in which the king checked local rulers, reminded them of their duties, and publicly renewed the bonds of loyalty. The Eastern Empire had not fallen apart. It needed to be visited and reaffirmed. What finally made Antiochus III famous, especially in Roman histories, was not his Eastern successes, but his war with Rome. Between 192 and 189 BC, he fought the Romans in Greece and Asia Minor. The conflict ended with his defeat at the Battle of Magnesia in Western Asia Minor. By the peace treaty signed at Apamea in 188 BC, Antiochus had to give up most of his possessions in Asia Minor. These lands were then shared between Rhodes and Pergamon. Within a year, Antiochus III was dead. Many historians see this as the beginning of the end for the Seleucid kingdom, since it had lost one of the richest and most strategic areas of its empire. Even so, the dynasty survived for roughly another century and continued to rule large territories in Syria and the east. Antiochus was succeeded by his son, Seleucus IV, who ruled from 187 to 175 BC. Our sources tend to present him as a weak figure, but it is hard to judge fairly. He inherited a kingdom burdened with heavy war indemnities to Rome and squeezed between aggressive neighbors. There was little room for bold foreign policy. Seleucus fell behind on his payments and kept only minimal contact with Rome. Instead, he focused on marriage alliances with other Hellenistic kings, such as Prusias of Bithynia and Perseus of Macedonia. In financial desperation, he sent his minister Heliodorus to take money from the temple in Jerusalem. The mission failed, and Heliodorus later arranged the king's murder. Because Seleucus had not cultivated close ties with Rome, the Romans' ally Eumenes II of Pergamon was able to intervene in the succession and support the claim of Seleucus's younger brother, Antiochus, to the throne, even though the legal heir, Demetrius, Seleucus's son, was being held in Rome as a hostage. A Greek decree praises Eumenes and his wife for helping Antiochus gain power. It is not fully clear whether the Roman Senate was offended, indifferent, or quietly pleased by this outcome, but the episode later gave Rome a reason to interfere again. This younger brother, now Antiochus IV, ruled from 175 to 164 BC and took the title Theos Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. Later writers mock him as eccentric, but he seems to have been an active and capable ruler. In his early years, he completed the payments of the Roman indemnity, took part in diplomatic exchanges, and sent generous gifts to Greek cities and sanctuaries for example at Olympia and Athens. His building programs and benefactions presented him as a cultured Greek king. The most dramatic moment of his reign came during the Sixth Syrian War, when he invaded Egypt and was on the point of success. In 168 BC, a Roman delegation met him near Alexandria and handed him a demand from the Senate to withdraw. The leader of the mission, Gaius Popilius Laenas, famously drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and told him to decide before stepping out of it. Faced with this direct threat, and remembering Rome's recent victories over his own father and over Macedonia, Antiochus backed down. His army withdrew from Egypt. This scene shows how far Roman influence had grown. Without conquering the Seleucid kingdom directly, Rome could now enforce its will in the eastern Mediterranean simply through diplomatic pressure backed by the threat of force. In all these episodes, we can see how the fortunes of individual kings, their wars, their family decisions, and their city foundations shaped the history of the Seleucid Empire. We also see how external powers, especially Rome, gradually learned how to weaken the kingdom not by occupying it, but by playing on its internal tensions and forcing its rulers to accept humiliating limits on their freedom of action. Antiochus was not broken by his humiliation in front of the Romans. Instead of hiding in his palace, he decided to show the world that his kingdom was still rich and powerful. Before he marched east, he organized a huge festival procession to the sanctuary of Apollo at Daphne, near Antioch, around 166 or 165 BCE. Ancient writers describe this parade as almost unbelievable in scale. In front marched about 36,000 soldiers, many of them carrying weapons and armor decorated with gold. There were 500 fighters trained to perform in front of crowds, almost 10,000 cavalry riders on horses with gold and silver fittings, and chariots drawn by hundreds of horses and even elephants. Behind them came hundreds of young men wearing golden crowns, more than 1,000 oxen for sacrifice, and many more animals and ivory gifts sent by foreign states. Statues of gods and spirits followed, some covered in gold, others in rich clothing, each one designed to match traditional myths. There were symbolic figures of night, day, earth, heaven, dawn, and midday. Then came slaves carrying heavy silver and gold vessels, women pouring perfume from golden containers, and richly dressed women seated on litters decorated with silver and gold. The message of this show was clear. Whatever Rome had done, the Seleucid king still ruled a wealthy and spectacular empire. After this display, Antiochus went east in 165 to 164. He restored Seleucid control in Greater Armenia, which had drifted away from the kingdom after 188. He tried to do something similar in parts of Iran, but fell ill and died during the campaign. If his goal was to slow the advance of the Parthians, he managed at least a temporary success. For this reason, many historians count him among the more capable Seleucid kings, even if his career ended suddenly. The Seleucids ruled a huge and diverse empire. They had to deal with great distances, many different peoples, and a mixture of old and new centers of power. They did this with energy and ambition, but also with a clear understanding that ruling by force alone would be too expensive and unstable. They learned much from their Persian predecessors. When Alexander defeated Darius, he took over the existing system of satrapies, which were regions governed by powerful local officials. Under the Persians, most satraps were Persian nobles or local rulers. Alexander and then Seleucus placed both Macedonians and local elites into these roles. The basic idea of the system was simple. The king did not try to control every village directly. Instead, he made sure the ruling elite of each area stayed loyal, paid tribute, and sent soldiers when needed. The king's main responsibilities were to pick reliable satraps, station royal officials in their courts to keep an eye on them, and occasionally lead military campaigns to punish those who went too far. This system had a clear weakness. It gave satraps many chances to increase their own power. A satrap could delay or refuse payment of tribute, behave like a king, and even declare independence. In such a case, the central king had only one real tool: military force. Until that moment, the satrap could enjoy a lot of freedom. Herodotus, writing earlier in the Persian period, lists the tribute each region was supposed to send. Even if the exact numbers are uncertain, they show which provinces were considered richest. Areas that later formed the Seleucid heartland, like Babylonia and Assyria, paid huge sums. Other regions like the Persian Gulf, Cilicia, Media, Western Asia Minor, Phoenicia, Syria, Palestine, and Cyprus also contributed heavily, sometimes in money and sometimes in ships or other supplies. Bactria paid a large amount by itself, while several eastern regions together paid a bit less. If we assume that the basic economy of these regions did not change completely, this gives us a rough picture of which Seleucid provinces mattered most for income. The Seleucids copied the main features of this structure. They watched potential satraps carefully, allowed long periods of non-interference, and then used royal campaigns to remind local rulers of their obligations. The empire contained many different types of local authority: old native dynasties, satraps appointed from the center, and independent Greek cities. The king's main aims were to keep tribute flowing and to ensure that he could raise a large army when required. An important point is that a province could be independent in daily life, but still recognize the king's supreme status. A satrap might continue to use royal symbols on coins or in official documents, even while delaying payments. It was only when someone openly claimed the royal title or seriously threatened the dynasty, as Achaeus did in Asia Minor, that the Seleucid kings used harsh punishments. Another key feature of Seleucid rule was their use of older local languages and traditions. They did not try to make Greek the only official language everywhere. In many places, the administration continued to use Aramaic and Akkadian, the languages of earlier empires. An inscription from the Temple of Ezida at Borsippa near Babylon, written in cuneiform, shows Antiochus I presenting himself in traditional Mesopotamian style. He calls himself Great King, King of the world, King of Babylon and lands, and caretaker of ancient temples. He describes how he personally took part in preparing bricks and laying the foundations of the temple, and then asks the god Nabu to grant him and his son a successful reign, victories over enemies, and long years of prosperity. This text shows how deeply the Seleucids engaged with local religious traditions and titles in order to win support and legitimacy. In some ways, the Seleucid kingdom reminds us of modern empires, with a ruling ethnic group, heavily taxed provinces, and the use of local elites to collect resources. But there are also big differences. The Seleucids did not try to unify laws or standardize economies in modern fashion. They ruled as Macedonian Greeks outside their old homeland, and at the same time, they were both founders and heirs of imperial structures. The idea of a single central core and a distant periphery is complicated here. There was no one permanent capital that controlled everything. At various times, Antioch, Seleucia on the Tigris, and older cities like Ecbatana, Susa, and Sardis all acted as royal centers. In practice, the core of the empire was wherever the king and his court were physically present. Antiochus III, for example, continued to deal with everyday matters while he was on campaign in Iran. At the same time, if we think in terms of social class, the core was the Greco-Macedonian elite who shared language, culture, and education, and dominated high office. A later Greek text on economic management, attributed to Aristotle's school, helps us imagine how the Seleucid system worked in practice. It explains that royal management has four main parts: money itself, exports, imports, and spending. The king decides what kind of coins to issue, what goods from the provinces to sell and when, and how to control expenses. Satrapic management is different. A satrap's income comes from land taxes, his own estates, trade and merchants, regular taxes on land and sales, taxes on animals and herds, and various personal taxes. The passage shows that the king and satraps are part of one connected system. The satrap collects and controls the flow of resources on the ground, while the king sits above that system and decides how to turn these resources into wealth and power for the royal house. Within each province, the king also had direct influence over some economic matters. Forests, mines, salt pans, and sometimes markets were probably royal property. Letters from Seleucid kings show them granting or adjusting rights over villages, estates, fairs, and tax exemptions. One letter, sent by a king named Antiochus to an official, concerns the sanctuary of Zeus at Diadochi in Syria. The king says that he has heard of the power of this god and decides to grant the village and its revenues to the sanctuary permanently. He orders that tax-free fairs be held there twice every month, and that the village be free from the burden of housing troops. This shows how royal control of land and revenues could be redirected towards religious sites, and how fairs and markets were closely linked to royal permission and taxation. Land ownership across the empire was complex. A famous inscription from Ilion in Western Asia Minor describes how Antiochus I granted large areas of land to a man named Aristodikides of Assos. The king orders his satrap Meleagros to make sure that a particular place called Petra and its surrounding territory have not already been granted to someone else, then to measure out a certain amount of arable land from royal estates and allow Aristodikides to attach it to whichever nearby city he chooses. The letter also mentions royal peoples, probably local villagers tied to the land, who could continue to live there under the new arrangement. Other documents show similar patterns: royal estates transferred to members of the royal family, estates granted to individuals along with attached villages, and cities gaining control of sacred villages whose revenues support temples. In the eastern parts of the empire, although we lack Greek inscriptions, it is likely that similar mixtures of royal, temple, communal, and private land existed, often following very old local customs. Even while constantly seeking revenue, kings could also act as benefactors. A later example from Asia Minor, involving King Eumenes II of Pergamon, probably has parallels in Seleucid practice. Poor settlers in a village complain that their trees do not yield much fruit, their land is poor, and they cannot pay what they owe on a plot they bought. The king investigates and then orders that they may keep the land without paying the remaining price, and that their poll tax be reduced and partly cancelled for certain years. He also tells them to repair their old fort and promises to pay for a skilled builder. This letter shows that rulers sometimes responded to local hardship. offering tax relief and practical help, both to support vulnerable communities and to protect strategic sites. Taken together, these examples show a picture of the Seleucid Empire that is much more than a simple story of rise and decline. The kings used spectacle and religion to display power, inherited and adapted a flexible system of provincial rule, relied on local languages and traditions, and constantly negotiated over land, taxes, and privileges. Their control was never absolute, and local rulers, cities, and communities always had some room to move. Yet for a long time, the system worked well enough to keep a vast, diverse territory under the loose but real authority of a Macedonian royal house. They borrowed many ideas from the earlier Persian rulers and from Mesopotamian traditions. Like the Achaemenid kings, they worked closely with the priests of Babylon and even paid for new building projects in the great temples. At the same time, they wanted to present themselves as special rulers chosen by the gods. From the reign of Antiochus I onwards, they encouraged honors for the royal house. Antiochus III later organized an official cult of the royal family, but even earlier, Antiochus I had allowed a cult for his father, Seleucus I. Stories also began to spread that Seleucus was descended from a god, or even the son of a god. In one decree from the city of Ilion, the citizens are told to sacrifice to Apollo as the ancestor of the royal family. Later, Seleucus II reminded the people of Miletus that his family had a special link to Apollo at Didyma and claimed a kind of kinship with the god. All of this helped to place the dynasty inside a sacred family tree and to justify their rule over Asia. The kings also used visual language to send a message about power. Starting with Antiochus I, the living king's portrait appears on coins. The king probably approved these images himself, even if they were not exact likenesses. Strangely, we do not have any securely identified statues of Seleucid rulers, but written sources preserve many stories about them. Appian, a later historian, collected a series of legends about Seleucus I. In these, Seleucus is shown as a heroic figure who wrestles a wild bull with his bare hands, which is why some of his images show him with small horns. Other stories describe signs from the gods during the foundations of his cities. When he built Seleucia by the sea and Seleucia on the Tigris, thunder, omens, and even the behavior of the army are presented as proof that the gods supported his plans. These tales underline several key themes: the cooperation between the king and local priests, respect for rituals, visible divine favor, and the king's almost superhuman strength. Hellenization and urbanization are another central part of the Seleucid story. Alexander and his successors settled large numbers of Greek and Macedonian soldiers in the Near East. Later, writers liked to imagine that Alexander and the kings after him civilized Asia by founding cities and spreading Greek culture. One author claims that Alexander taught non-Greek peoples how to marry properly, farm the land, care for their parents, and respect their mothers. He says that Alexander founded more than 70 cities and scattered Greek institutions across Asia. This picture is exaggerated and idealized. Alexander did not found all those cities alone, and his motives and those of the Seleucid kings were not purely moral. They wanted control, security, and profit as well as prestige. Even so, it is true that Seleucus I and Antiochus I were extremely active city founders, especially in the eastern regions. The pattern of change was not the same everywhere. Some parts of the empire, such as Iran, were mainly village-based before Alexander and stayed that way. There were already many cities in the older heartlands of Mesopotamia. At Uruk, for example, there is no sign of Greek influence in the Seleucid period. Babylon probably gained a Greek-speaking community, but it kept its ancient name and role. In other places, the kings acted more directly. At Sardis, in western Asia Minor, after a siege and destruction, Antiochus II rebuilt the city with a new street plan and Greek-style buildings. Elsewhere, a Greek name, Greek institutions, and a Greek citizen body were added on top of an existing non-Greek town, as at Beroea, and probably also in the Seleucid attempt to turn Jerusalem into a city called Antioch. The old Persian capital Susa received Greek and Macedonian settlers and was refounded under a new name, Seleucia, on the Eulaios. In other locations, the kings built cities almost from scratch, with Greek-style councils, assemblies, and magistrates. Examples include Apamea on the Orontes, Seleucia in Pieria, and Dura Europos. Sometimes a new Greek city replaced an earlier foundation of a rival ruler, as when Seleucus destroyed Antigonus's city Antigonea and moved the people to his new Antioch. Sometimes a Greek city rose beside an older native capital, as Seleucia on the Tigris did next to Babylon. Many of these foundations had a strong military character. The Seleucids created garrison settlements called katoikiai, populated mainly by Greek and Macedonian veterans. These were meant to secure frontiers, watch important roads, and act as centers of royal influence. Greek culture spread through institutions like the gymnasium, where young men trained both physically and intellectually, but admission was selective. In some polis, the native population gradually became part of the citizen body, while in others there was a clearer divide between Greek settlers and local people. A famous example of Greek urban life far to the east is Iconium on the Oxus. There, archaeologists have found a theater, temple, gymnasium, long colonnades, a grand house, a strong citadel, and fortifications, mixed with architectural details that echo earlier Persian styles. Another example is the site of Icaros on Failaka Island in the Gulf, probably a Greek trading post and settlement that grew around an older local cult place. Founding and naming cities also served as dynastic propaganda. Many cities were named after members of the royal family. Later writers say that Seleucus founded numerous cities called Antioch, Seleucia, Laodicea, and Apamea, after himself, his father, his mother, and his wife. Other cities carried the names of towns in Greece and Macedonia, or celebrated victories with names like Nicephorion and Nicopolis. Whether or not every detail is exact, the overall effect is clear. Everywhere people traveled, they would see reminders of the royal house in the names of the places around them. This helped tie distant landscapes together under one dynasty, at least symbolically. Life inside these cities followed familiar Greek patterns, but always under the shadow of royal power. Many polis had an assembly, council, and elected officials, and they issued decrees in their own name. However, important decisions often depended on the king's approval. When the city of Magnesia on the Meander wanted its new festival to be recognized as equal to the famous games at Delphi, it was the Seleucid king who had to accept the request and order other cities to honor the festival. Old Greek cities were usually treated with respect by the kings, and in theory remained independent partners. But the balance of power was unequal. A good example is Demadamus of Miletus. He was both a general in Seleucus's service and an important citizen in his home city. In Miletus, he helped to pass decrees honoring Antiochus I and supported building projects at the sanctuary of Apollo at Didyma. Through men like him, a relatively small city could influence royal policy and receive gifts, even though it was far away from the main centers of the empire. These links show how local elites and the royal court were connected in a long chain of mutual benefit. In the 2nd century BC, the most famous clash between the Seleucid monarchy and a non-Greek community happened in Jerusalem. Later, Jewish and Greek writers tell this story from different angles, and the details are often debated, but we can follow the main line. For a long time, Jerusalem and Judea had been ruled by the Ptolemies of Egypt. Some Jews already disliked this rule and were suspicious of attempts to spread Greek-style cults and customs. When Antiochus III of the Seleucid dynasty defeated the Ptolemies and took southern Syria and Judea around 200 BC, he presented himself as a protector of local traditions. He allowed the Jews to live according to their own law, supported the temple with generous gifts of animals, grain, oil, and salt, and promised help for rebuilding sacred buildings. At the same time, the Seleucid king clearly claimed the right to appoint or confirm the high priest in Jerusalem, so control over religion and politics was already tightly connected. When Seleucus IV died and Antiochus IV Epiphanes took the throne, a struggle for power broke out inside the Jewish leadership. Jason, the brother of the high priest Onias, promised Antiochus a very large sum of money and extra revenues if he were given the high priesthood. Antiochus agreed, and Jason began to reshape Jerusalem along Greek lines. He asked for permission to create a gymnasium and an organized group of young men trained in the Greek style, and he wanted citizens of Jerusalem to be officially called Antiochenes, linking the city symbolically to the Seleucid capital. Ancient Jewish authors say that many priests became more interested in exercise and athletics than in temple duties, and that some young men wore Greek sun hats and joined in the new gymnasium culture. At the same time, sacrifices at the temple continued. This suggests that, at first, adopting Greek customs did not automatically mean abandoning Jewish religion. It also shows that the first push toward Hellenization in Jerusalem came from a local elite who wanted royal favor and a new kind of prestige, not simply from orders imposed from above. Later, Jason was replaced by another high priest, Menelaus, probably through further royal favor and money. Under Menelaus, internal tension and violence increased. While Antiochus IV was campaigning in Egypt, rumors spread that he had died. Fighting broke out in Jerusalem between rival groups. When Antiochus heard of this, he marched on the city. He punished resistance harshly, killed many people, and allowed his soldiers to plunder the temple treasury. A Seleucid garrison was installed. Soon after, the policy changed from simple control and profit to something much more radical. Ancient Jewish sources say that Antiochus ordered all peoples in his kingdom to become one people and to give up their particular customs. In Judea, this meant a direct attack on Jewish law. Sacrifices and festivals were banned, the Sabbath was no longer to be kept, parents were forbidden to circumcise their sons, and people were forced to eat forbidden foods. New altars and shrines were ordered, and unclean animals were sacrificed on them. For many Jews, this was not just political pressure. It felt like a direct attack on their identity and on the covenant with their God. Writers speak of the abomination of desolation on the temple altar. Later traditions claim that statues of Zeus Olympios and perhaps of Antiochus himself were set up in the temple precinct, and that the sanctuary was rededicated to a Greek god. Modern scholars argue about the exact details, but it is clear that for a short time, Jewish law and worship were officially outlawed in Jerusalem. This does not mean that Antiochus suddenly believed in one god only. It is more likely that he tried to impose Greek-style cults and symbols for political reasons, perhaps to punish rebellion, to secure a restless frontier, and to show that royal orders could not be ignored. In choosing such extreme measures against a community with very strong traditions, he made a serious miscalculation. The reaction was the Maccabean Revolt. Around 166 or 165 BC, Mattathias and his sons, especially Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, began a guerrilla war against Seleucid forces and Jewish collaborators. They fought not just for political freedom, but to restore the law and purify the temple. They won a series of victories, retook Jerusalem, cleansed the sanctuary, and restarted the sacrifices. While they were fighting, Antiochus went east to deal with problems in Armenia and Iran, and he died there. Under financial and military pressure, he or his successors began to change course. Letters sent in the names of Antiochus and later of the young king Antiochus V promised amnesty and a return to ancestral laws. The temple was officially returned to the Jews, and they were allowed to follow their customs again. In practice, however, the rebels had already taken control of the city and were not going to give it up easily. Over the next decades, the descendants of Mattathias moved from being rebel leaders to becoming recognized rulers. They made an alliance with Rome, which enjoyed any chance to weaken the Seleucid kingdom. They accepted Seleucid titles and honors when it suited them, but they expanded Judean territory whenever the central government was distracted. By the late 2nd century BC, Seleucid kings were forced to grant major tax remissions and political concessions to keep Jewish support. Eventually, after Antiochus VII died fighting the Parthians, Judea became effectively independent and stayed that way until the Roman general Pompey reorganized the eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century BC. Ironically, an attempt to crush Jewish identity had strengthened it. The Jews emerged from this period more organized, more confident, and more determined to defend their way of life. This episode shows a local failure of Seleucid policy, but does not prove that the whole empire was collapsing at that time. It does show how dangerous heavy-handed cultural interference could be when aimed at a community with a very strong internal tradition. Another early and important break from Seleucid control happened in Western Asia Minor, in the city of Pergamon. This town was not very famous in the classical period. At first, it was simply the place where Lysimachus, one of Alexander's successors, kept his royal treasury under the supervision of a trusted officer named Philoterus, the son of a Macedonian called Attalus. Around 283 BC, Philoterus switched his loyalty from Lysimachus to Seleucus, handing the treasure and the stronghold to the new master. He kept his position, now acting in the name of the Seleucid kings. His portrait did not appear with a royal title, but his name was already on local coins beside the head of Seleucus. Over time, Pergamon's influence grew. Philoterus gave money to nearby Greek cities, supported sanctuaries like that of the mother goddess near Pergamon, and even defeated Galatian raiders. The groundwork was being laid for an independent dynasty, later called the Attalids. Eumenes I, Philoterus's nephew and adopted son, ruled after him. He did not yet call himself king, but acted as an independent dynast. Within a short time, he defeated Antiochus I in battle and stopped paying tribute. His coins now showed the head of Philetaerus rather than that of Seleucus, sending a message that Pergamon no longer accepted Seleucid authority. The city now controlled its own harbor at Elaia and probably had a fleet. He was followed by Attalus I, who reigned from the mid-3rd to the early 2nd century BC and became the first Attalid king in title. Attalus refused to continue paying protection money to the Galatian tribes, raised a strong army instead of relying mostly on mercenaries, and defeated them in several campaigns. In celebration, spectacular sculptures showing dying and fighting Gauls and other barbarians were set up, presenting Pergamon as a defender of the Greek world. Attalus also took advantage of the internal conflicts of the Seleucid family. He fought against Antiochus the Hawk, brother of Seleucus II, and gained territories in western Asia Minor when this pretender fell. Some of these lands were lost briefly to another rebel, Achaeos, but Attalus managed to recover them. Eventually, he formed an alliance with Antiochus III against Achaeos, and this marked a turning point. The Seleucid monarchy began to treat Pergamon not as a rebellious subject, but as a recognized kingdom. At the same time, Attalus built close links with Greek states in the Aegean and with the rising Romans. In the First Macedonian War, he supported Rome and its allies, helped to hold key islands and ports, and earned formal recognition as a friend of Rome. His prestige in mainland Greece was high. He was honored in Athens, probably built monuments there and at Delphi, and associated Pergamon with famous Greek victories over giants, Amazons, Persians, and Gauls through artistic dedications. Under Eumenes II, Attalus's son, Pergamon, reached the height of its territorial power. Eumenes continued his father's policy of friendship with southern Greek states and of generous gifts to important sanctuaries. At the same time, he followed Rome's lead in major conflicts. When Antiochus III came into conflict with Rome, Pergamon sided firmly with Rome. The result was the Peace of Apamea in 188 BC, where Rome stripped the Seleucids of most of their holdings in Asia Minor and awarded large areas to Pergamon. From then on, Pergamon was the leading power in Western Asia Minor, though it still had to deal with neighboring kingdoms like Pontus, Bithynia, and Galatia. A remarkable inscription from a small community in Phrygia helps us see how Eumenes II presented his rule and how Roman power stood behind it. In this text, local representatives come to him with congratulations and a request. Now that he has secured the region with Roman help, they ask to be organized as a proper Greek-style polis with their own laws, a council, magistrates, tribal divisions, and a gymnasium for their youth. Eumenes replies that now that he has received the land legitimately from the Romans, any favor he grants will be real and lasting. He agrees to let them form a single citizen body, use their own laws, and build a gymnasium. He promises experts to help them set up their institutions and says that he will arrange revenues to pay for oil for the young men who trained there. In this way, he ties together three things: his dependence on Rome, his role as benefactor and civilizer, and the desire of local communities to gain prestige by adopting Greek political and cultural forms. During his reign, Eumenes fought wars against Bithynia, Pontus, and the Galatians. The Romans intervened several times to protect Pergamon and restrain its enemies. Victories over the Gauls earned Eumenes the title Nikephoros, bringer of victory, and he founded a festival of Athena Nikephoros at Pergamon that attracted Greek participants from many regions. The wealth and security gained after the Peace of Apamea allowed the Attalids to transform their citadel into a spectacular royal center full of terraces, halls, temples, and libraries. They even created a new coinage, the Sistophoroi, with a special design that expressed their new status and distance from the Seleucid past. In the later 2nd century BC, the balance of power around Pergamon and Syria began to change. Eumenes II of Pergamon had once been one of Rome's most trusted partners. He even supported Antiochus IV in his struggle for the Seleucid throne, and had helped Rome against the Macedonian king Perseus. But once Rome destroyed the kingdom of Macedonia, it no longer needed Pergamon as a counterweight in Greece. The Senate started to look at Eumenes with suspicion. They refused to grant him an audience, listened instead to his enemies, and even encouraged the Galatian tribes to cause trouble for him. At the same time, neighboring kings who were hostile to Pergamon suddenly found the doors of the Senate open to them. Yet in Asia Minor itself, Eumenes was still highly respected. Local cities honored him with festivals, statues, and long decrees, showing that, in their eyes, he was still a powerful and generous ruler, even if Rome had cooled toward him. Rhodes went through something similar. It had been a major naval power and a close friend of Rome, controlling many islands and helping to keep pirates in check. After the wars with Macedonia, Rome cut its influence, took away territory, and weakened its role in the Aegean. Rhodian power at sea declined, and its ability to police piracy was challenged by other groups, especially Cretan communities. At the same time, Rhodes reinvented itself as a center of learning and philosophy. Its schools of rhetoric and thought attracted students from across the Greek world, even as its political weight decreased. When Attalus II came to the throne in Pergamon, nothing really changed in terms of dependence on Rome. A remarkable private letter, later carved in stone, shows how carefully he and his advisors watched Roman reactions. In this letter to a Galatian priest, Attalus explains that he and his inner circle had discussed plans for war against the Gauls. At first, most of his advisors agreed with his idea, but one man kept warning that nothing should be done without first asking the Romans. After long debate, Attalus admits that acting without Roman approval seemed too dangerous. This letter reveals how deeply Pergamene kings felt the need to stay within Roman expectations. They understood that their foreign policy was no longer truly independent. Even so, Attalus II remained active and successful within those limits. When Prosias of Bithynia attacked Pergamene lands, Attalus fought back and, with Roman diplomatic backing, protected his kingdom. When Attalus later tried, together with the king of Cappadocia, to punish the city of Priene for a local dispute, the Senate stepped in and blocked any change to the existing situation. Rome wanted stability on its own terms. Attalus still found room to maneuver. He helped overthrow Prusias in favor of his son Nicomedes, suppressed raids by Thracian warriors against coastal cities, and sent troops to aid Rome in its wars in Greece. At home, Pergamon remained rich and impressive. Attalus built or rebuilt cities and gave famous gifts to Greek communities, such as the long colonnaded hall in the Athenian Agora that still bears his name. His successor, Attalus III, is portrayed very negatively by ancient writers, who call him cruel or eccentric. But these stories may be exaggerated or even invented. What seems clear is that he had a strong personal interest in art, science, and technical skills, and that he did perform normal royal tasks like dealing with priesthoods and local administration, even if he may have left much of the day-to-day work to officials. His most shocking act, however, was in foreign policy. When he died childless, he left his entire kingdom to the Roman people in his will. We do not know his motives. Perhaps he wanted to prevent his half-brother Aristonicus from seizing the throne. Perhaps he thought that Roman control was inevitable and wanted a peaceful transition. In any case, his decision had big consequences. In Rome, politicians used the wealth and lands of Pergamon to fuel internal debates over land reform. Aristonicus did not accept this outcome. He claimed to be the true heir, took the royal name Eumenes III, and began a revolt. Some ancient writers say he tried to win support from slaves and poor people in the countryside, which made him look like a kind of Greek Spartacus. He probably tried first to gain backing from cities and powerful allies, and turned to the lower classes only when those hopes failed. At the same time, Pergamon itself tried to secure its position by granting citizenship to various groups of soldiers living in the city and its territory, hoping to bind them more closely to the civic community. Another decree shows Pergamon, or its port city, celebrating its special link with Rome by creating a festival in honor of the goddess Roma. All this makes clear how closely the kingdom's fate was now tied to Roman goodwill. A wide alliance formed against Aristonicus, including Roman forces, other kings, and Greek cities in Asia Minor. The war was hard fought, and even a Roman consul and the king of Cappadocia lost their lives. Eventually, Aristonicus was defeated and executed. After the fighting, a Roman commission came to Asia Minor and organized a new province called Asia, carved out of the old Pergamene kingdom. Pergamon's long independence was over. Its lands became a tax-paying region of the Roman state. With Pergamon absorbed, Rome's main focus in the eastern Mediterranean shifted toward the weakened Seleucid kingdom based in Syria. During the century after the last great eastern expedition of a Seleucid king, it became harder and harder for the Seleucid dynasty to hold its lands together. Roman interference increased, and the Parthian kingdom in Iran grew stronger. Inside Syria, members of the royal family fought each other, courtiers plotted, and rulers were often overthrown or killed after only a few years on the throne. After the death of Antiochus IV, his young son Antiochus V became king under a regent. Roman envoys stepped in to confirm or approve decisions that were not really their business, and they ordered reductions in the Seleucid army to keep it weak. When Demetrius, the son of a previous king, asked Rome to support his claim, they refused, preferring a child king they could more easily control. Demetrius escaped on his own, seized the throne as Demetrius I, and tried to rebuild the kingdom by winning back Babylonia and other eastern regions. But in Asia Minor, his moves were blocked by Roman pressure, and his attempt to interfere in Egypt made new enemies. Later, Rome and its allies backed a rival claimant, Alexander Balas, who defeated and killed Demetrius I. Under this new ruler, the Seleucid court became openly dependent on foreign support, and important eastern provinces slipped away. Media was taken by the Parthians, and Susiana fell under the control of a local dynasty in Elymai. Another royal son, Demetrius II, eventually fought his way to power and ruled for a time, but his harsh style and poor decisions led to widespread unrest, new claimants like Diadochi Tryphon, and more turmoil in Judea. The Jewish leaders used these rivalries to increase their own autonomy and then their independence. When Demetrius II marched east to try to recover Babylon and surrounding areas, he was captured by the Parthians. His brother Antiochus VII took over, defeated internal enemies, forced Judea back into obedience for a short time, and organized a major eastern campaign. For a moment it looked as if Seleucid power in Mesopotamia might be restored, but Antiochus VII was killed in battle in Iran. After that, the Seleucids never again controlled their old eastern heartlands. Their kingdom shrank to Syria and parts of Cilicia, while neighbors like the Jews and the Nabateans consolidated their gains. Even so, it would be wrong to say that the Seleucid state collapsed overnight, or that it was doomed from the beginning. Antiochus VII came very close to beating the Parthians, and there is no sign that the Seleucid army was inherently weak. The real problem was that the kings faced strong, growing rivals on two fronts: Parthia in the east and Rome in the west. Roman demands, diplomatic pressure, and occasional military threats constantly distracted and limited them. At the same time, Parthian advances pulled them into long, expensive campaigns far from their Syrian base. The loss of Mesopotamia was a disaster for the dynasty, but for the local population, many administrative structures continued under their new rulers. After the death of Demetrius II, the last century of the Seleucid house was dominated by civil wars and short-lived kings. Mothers killed sons, brothers fought brothers, and cousins split the remaining territory between them. At one point, the people of Antioch were so tired of this chaos that they invited Tigranes of Armenia to take over. Later, a final Seleucid prince briefly returned with Roman permission, but eventually the Roman general Pompey ended the dynasty and turned Syria into a Roman province. During these years, neighboring kingdoms copied many aspects of Seleucid court culture, using Greek names and mixed traditions. They were not driven by modern-style nationalism or a burning desire to throw out foreign rulers. Most of them would probably have returned to paying tribute to a strong, great king if the Seleucids had somehow defeated the Parthians and recovered their old strength. Modern discussions sometimes claim that the Seleucids were doomed because a small foreign elite cannot rule a large, diverse empire. But the Persian kings had already shown that such a system could work for centuries, and the Seleucids built directly on that model. Other writers argue that the Seleucids failed because they did not standardize law, introduce new technology, or improve everyday life for their subjects. This is a modern way of thinking. Ancient empires did not aim to reform society. Their main goals were to secure loyalty, collect taxes, control key regions, and win glory in war. The Seleucids largely used existing local systems of administration and tax, adding their own officials on top. They founded many cities and spread Greek language and culture among the elites, but they did not try to erase older traditions. Evidence from sites like Ai-Khanum and the island of Seleucia suggests that Greeks and non-Greeks lived close to each other without strict physical separation. We also know of non-Greek officials who managed estates and sanctuaries for high-ranking Macedonian or Greek nobles. This picture does not match the idea of a completely closed ruling class. Distance and communication were always a challenge, of course, just as they had been under the Persians. Messages and armies took months to cross the empire. But distance alone cannot explain which regions were lost and which remained loyal longest. Asia Minor, relatively close to Syria, was hard to control because many local dynasts and cities had their own ambitions and because Roman fleets and armies could appear quickly. Outer Iran, much farther away, stayed attached in one form or another until well into the 2nd century BC, thanks to working arrangements with local rulers. In the end, What broke Seleucid power was not an internal flaw in their system, but the rise of new great powers. Rome and Parthia had their own armies, their own ambitions, and their own methods of control. Roman commanders could now confront Seleucid kings confidently, as when Popilius drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus IV and demanded an instant answer. The king knew what lay behind that gesture, the proven strength of Roman legions, which had already beaten both Macedonian and Seleucid forces in open battle. So the Seleucid Empire did not simply fall apart because it was foreign, or because its rulers were Macedonians living far from home. Its structure was heavily based on earlier Near Eastern empires, especially the Achaemenid Persians, with a Greek royal layer on top. Its lands were slowly chipped away over many decades by external military competition and by the constant pressure of Rome's diplomacy. Had a few battles gone differently, the story could have changed, at least for a time. But once Rome was firmly established as the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and the Parthians held Iran and Mesopotamia, there was no longer room for a large, independent Seleucid kingdom in between. For the study of plants, the most important figure is Theophrastus, the student and successor of Aristotle. His botanical works grow directly out of earlier research, but also use new information collected by people who traveled with Alexander the Great into Asia and beyond. Theophrastus did not really perform experiments in the modern sense, but he observed, compared, and classified plants in a systematic way. He tried to explain plants by reason, not magic. In his major work on plants, written around 300 BC, he begins by asking what parts plants have, how they are born, how they grow, and how they differ from each other. He then describes trees, shrubs, and herbs, gives examples from many regions, and talks about how to cultivate them, how they respond to water, soil, and climate, and what kind of timber or juice they produce. His style is careful and impersonal, and he often adds, "they say," when he reports information from farmers and observers around the Mediterranean. Later, in a more theoretical work on the causes of plant behavior, he tries to explain why crops react in certain ways to rain, drying, piling, and storage. He also writes about smells, spices, and medicinal plants, giving recipes and uses from traditional herbal practice. At the same time, we see royal interest in plants and agriculture. Kings like the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Attalids in Asia Minor used their wealth to import new varieties of trees, vines, and animals, sometimes for profit, and sometimes to show off. Estates run by royal officials experimented with fast-growing wheat, special breeds of sheep, and vineyards that could produce wines as good as famous island wines. Some kings, like Attalus of Pergamon, were said to be obsessed with medicinal plants and even poisonous herbs, using gardens as laboratories for medicines and, perhaps, for more sinister purposes. Exotic plants and animals in royal processions and palaces were not just luxuries, they were also symbols of control over distant lands and climates. Medicine in this period developed along similar lines. It did not suddenly become modern, but it built on earlier traditions and pushed them further. Important centers of medical learning were the island of Kos and the great city of Alexandria. Doctors grouped themselves into loose schools with different theories, but they all worked within a shared Greek medical culture. One early figure is Praxagoras of Kos, who revised older ideas about the fluids of the body and gained a reputation as a sharp observer. Two of the most famous physicians are Hierophilus of Chalcedon and Erasistratus of Ceos, both active in the 3rd century BC and connected with Alexandria. Herophilus mapped the nervous system, distinguished nerves that carry movement from those that carry sensation, described parts of the brain and eye, and studied the liver and reproductive organs. He used the pulse as a key sign of health and disease. Erasistratus studied the heart and its valves and tried to build one unified theory linking breath, blood, nerves, muscles, appetite, and digestion. He thought inhaled air was transformed inside the body into a kind of vital breath and then into blood. Both men used dissection of animals and, most likely, humans to test their ideas. Later writers say that they even dissected living prisoners given to them by kings, which shocked some ancient and many modern readers, but shows how far royal power could go in the name of knowledge. These doctors belonged to a group that believed understanding the hidden structure of the body was essential. Other doctors, sometimes called empiricists, argued that theory was dangerous and that the physician should focus only on visible symptoms and experience. In any case, doctors in this period were usually practicing professionals, not just theorists. They earned their living from their art, received honors from cities, and could enjoy high status. In some places, official charters even set out their rights and duties as public professionals. At the same time, medicine overlapped with religion. The healing god Asclepios became more popular, and people went to his sanctuaries to sleep, dream, and seek cures. Kings supported such sanctuaries for prestige and personal reasons. Famous texts like the Hippocratic Oath, probably shaped around this time, show a strong moral ideal of the doctor: to avoid poison and abortion, to respect confidentiality, to honor one's teacher, and to recognize the limits of one's own work. Medical writers also connected health, climate, and character. One influential work says that climate affects the diseases and even the temperament of different peoples. Later, Aristotle and others built this into a bigger theory. Peoples in cold northern regions were brave but less intellectually subtle. Peoples in the warm east were clever and skilled but less spirited. And Greeks, living in a middle zone, had the best balance of courage and intelligence. Later authors adapted this scheme to flatter new ruling peoples, for example by saying that Italians and Romans occupied the ideal climate, and so were naturally suited to rule. Astronomy offers another good example of how Hellenistic science joined older traditions with new tools and ideas. Early Greek poets used stars mainly as seasonal markers for farming and sailing. Philosophers later suggested that the Earth was round and tried to explain eclipses, but they had only a rough idea about the planets. By the 4th century BC, thinkers were trying to describe heavenly motions using geometry and imagined the stars and planets attached to spheres. They drew on ideas and observations from Mesopotamia, where star watching had a long history. In the Hellenistic period, astronomers continued this line of work, but with improved instruments and more precise aims. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century BC, is a key figure. He refined instruments such as sighting devices and possibly armillary spheres, which used rings to represent the paths of celestial bodies. So, when we look at Hellenistic science for a video audience, we should see a connected world. Philosophers developing systems, observers collecting detailed information, kings funding gardens, libraries and laboratories, engineers building machines for war and for spectacle, and doctors dissecting, diagnosing, and debating. Their work was shaped by their social position, by royal power, by cities and sanctuaries, and by big ideas about nature and humanity. It did not look like modern science, but it was a serious and complex attempt to understand the world and to use that understanding in daily life, politics, and culture. They wanted to name, measure, and symbolically claim both peoples and landscapes. From the time of Herodotus, who tried to describe all the known nations, up to the great maps and universal geographies of the Roman age, there was a long project of listing and classifying the Earth. When we place Hellenistic astronomy inside this wider context, especially after the conquests of Alexander, the wish to catalog stars, constellations, latitudes, and longitudes becomes part of a single, coherent way of thinking. If you rule the land, you should also understand and organize the heavens above it. Astronomers such as Hipparchus did not only look upward, they also helped create a grid for the Earth itself. He probably designed the first detailed system of latitude and longitude, building on ideas that Eratosthenes already knew. Later, Ptolemy, in his great astronomical manual, preserved much of this work. Other thinkers tried to measure the size of the Earth. Eratosthenes used the different lengths of shadows at midday in 2 cities in Egypt to calculate the circumference of the globe, and arrived at a result surprisingly close to the real number. Others estimated the distance to the sun and named new constellations. Conon of Samos, for example, identified a small group of stars as the Hair of Berenice in honor of a queen. All of this shows how astronomy, geography, and royal propaganda were deeply connected. Naming the sky could be a way of honoring rulers and reinforcing their image as masters of a vast, ordered cosmos. One of the most famous ideas from this world is the heliocentric model of Aristarchus of Samos. Most ancient thinkers believed the Earth stood still at the center, while the sun, moon, and stars moved around it. Aristarchus suggested the opposite, that the sun stands at the center, that the Earth moves around it in a circle, and that the stars are so far away that the Earth's orbit is tiny by comparison. We know about this from a text by Archimedes. Only a handful of later astronomers, like Seleucus of Seleucia, took this idea seriously. Many others rejected it. They had what seemed like good reasons. Respected philosophers said the Earth could not move. Everyday experience suggested that objects fall toward the Earth as if it were the natural center. And if the Earth really raced around the sun, they expected to see the stars shift slightly in position, a tiny wobble that we call stellar parallax. With the tools of the time, this effect was impossible to detect. Seen from their perspective, the traditional Earth-centered model seemed safer and easier to defend. Aristarchus was not ignored because people were irrational, but because his idea clashed with almost every other assumption about nature, physics, and the gods. The same logic applies to the famous system of epicycles and off-center circles developed by astronomers such as Apollonius of Perge, and later perfected by Hipparchus and Ptolemy. To explain why planets sometimes move backward against the background of stars, they imagined each planet moving on a small circle whose center itself travels along a larger circle. Today we know that the real explanation lies in elliptical orbits and the motion of the Earth. But for many centuries, these layered circles gave accurate predictions. They could match observations with reasonable precision using only geometry. Because the model worked for their purposes, there was no strong pressure to abandon it. This again shows that Hellenistic science was not based on blind faith, but on methods that seemed to fit the data and the philosophical framework of the time. Astrology grew out of the same environment. There was no sharp line between astronomy, which tracks the motions of the heavens, and astrology, which claims to interpret their effects on human lives. Many astronomers also cast horoscopes. Greek thinkers combined older ideas from Babylon, where detailed star records and birth charts already existed, with their own methods in cities like Alexandria. Ptolemy, for example, carefully distinguishes between better and worse forms of astrology. He accepts that the sun and moon influence tides, weather, plants, and animals, and argues that other heavenly bodies may also have subtle effects. He criticizes fortune tellers who promise impossible predictions, but defends a more disciplined, scientific astrology that uses mathematics and observation. From our point of view, the whole system does not work, but inside their worldview, it seemed rational to connect the regular patterns of the sky with patterns in human life. Mathematics underpinned all of this. Euclid in Alexandria organized geometry into a clear system of definitions, axioms, and proofs. He started from basic ideas such as a point is that which has no parts, and built up a logical structure that would dominate geometry for 2,000 years. Later, mathematicians like Apollonius studied conic sections, while Archimedes pushed the limits of calculation with new methods for measuring areas and volumes and estimating numbers like piomai. At the same time, mechanics and pure math came together in very practical ways. Devices such as the Antikythera mechanism, a complex arrangement of gears that could track the movement of the sun and moon, show how far Hellenistic engineers could go in turning theory into machines. This blend of abstract thought and clever technology is one of the most striking features of the age. Finally, we need to place all of this scientific work into the wider story of exploration, empire, and trade. Greek and later Roman rulers wanted information about their realms and about lands beyond their borders. Eratosthenes not only measured the earth, but also wrote a grand geography that divided the known world into continents and climate zones. Explorers and officers working for kings, such as Patroclus in the east of the Seleucid Empire, or Agathocles and Eudoxus along the Red Sea and toward India, combined curiosity with economic and military aims. They described coastlines, winds, rivers, and peoples, often with an eye to potential routes for commerce or war. Some independent travelers, like Pythias of Massalia, pushed even further north, claiming to have reached a mysterious place called Thule near the frozen sea. His stories were doubted by some later writers, partly because they seemed to outshine the achievements of more aristocratic authors. But modern research suggests that much of what he said was plausible. All of this reminds us that knowledge in the Hellenistic and early Roman worlds was never neutral. Measuring the earth, mapping the stars, and describing distant shores were also ways of claiming status, supporting royal power, and shaping how educated audiences imagined their place in a vast, ordered universe. In the end, when we step back from all these names, dates, and technical details, what we see is not just a set of clever inventions or isolated discoveries, but a whole way of living and thinking in the Hellenistic world. Kings like the Attalids of Pergamon and the Seleucid rulers in Syria tried to hold together large and fragile kingdoms, while Rome and Parthia slowly tightened the net around them. At the same time, philosophers, mathematicians, doctors, engineers, and geographers were using their free time, their royal connections, and their education to explore almost every corner of the natural world. Plants, bodies, machines, stars, numbers, and distant lands. None of this was science in the modern professional sense, but it formed a rich, experimental culture in which observation, theory, and social status were always tightly connected. We have seen how power and knowledge moved together. Pergamon owed much of its rise and fall to Roman suspicion. Eumenes and Attalos had to act under constant pressure from the Senate, adjusting their foreign policy, fighting Gauls, supporting or calming revolts, and building monuments like the famous Stoa in Athens to show their wealth and piety. In the east, Seleucid kings struggled to hold Babylonia, Media, and the Iranian satrapies, while Rome interfered in dynastic disputes and Parthian rulers slowly took over the old Persian heartlands. These kingdoms could not plan in peace. They were always balancing diplomacy, war, and internal rivalries. Yet even in this unstable political world, rulers invested in intellectual prestige. They invited scholars to Alexandria and Pergamon. They funded expeditions, and they sometimes even wrote or sponsored technical treatises on agriculture or medicine themselves. Being seen as a patron of learning was one more way to legitimize their rule. Within this environment, scientific work developed in a very particular shape. Most investigators were members of the social elite, not state employees with fixed research jobs. They moved easily between philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, geography, and sometimes politics. The same person could write on geometry, edit poets, serve as a court advisor, or go on diplomatic missions. Their audience was a narrow circle of educated people who enjoyed reading, debate, and intellectual display. This is why we see a blend of serious theory and playful invention. Water organs that both demonstrate pneumatic principles and entertain guests. Elaborate water clocks that keep civic time but also show off clever mechanisms or astronomical models that are at once scientific tools and conversation pieces. Knowledge was a form of cultural capital. It reinforced status, reputation, and connections as much as it solved technical problems. At the same time, it would be wrong to imagine these thinkers as pure dreamers, lost in abstract speculation. They repeatedly tested and refined their ideas. Engineers experimented with catapult dimensions, adjusting springs and frames until range and accuracy improved. Doctors like Herophilus and Erasistratus dissected bodies, compared structures, and tried to link what they saw to patterns of disease and recovery. Astronomers built instruments, made long series of observations, and produced star catalogs and planetary models that could predict eclipses and positions with impressive precision. Eratosthenes used shadows at different latitudes to estimate the size of the Earth. Hipparchus detected the slow shift of the equinoxes over decades of observation. Even when they reached conclusions that we now consider wrong, such as the Earth-centered cosmos or arteries filled with pneuma rather than blood, they followed lines of reasoning that made sense inside their conceptual world and with the tools available to them. Perhaps the most important lesson is that we should not judge this period by how far it anticipated modern science, but by what it actually tried to do in its own terms. Astronomy was not just a step on the way to Copernicus. It was part of a broader project of mapping and taming the universe, tying together the sky and the Earth in a single, ordered picture. Geography was not only about making accurate maps, it was also about framing distant peoples and lands in a way that supported imperial ambitions and elite curiosity. Medicine did not simply march toward later anatomy. It created frameworks for understanding the human body that also carried ethical ideas, social hierarchies, and cultural assumptions about gender, climate, and ethnicity. Even astrology, which we now place outside science, was experienced by many as a rational extension of observed connections between the heavens and earthly life. By the time the last Seleucid kings were fighting over a shrinking territory and Pergamon had been turned into a Roman province, the intellectual tools shaped in the Hellenistic age were already spreading into the Roman world. Roman generals, officials, and authors borrowed Greek astronomy, geography, medicine, and mathematics, reinterpreting them to serve their own imperial story. Fortifications, engines of war, water-lifting devices, and surveying methods shaped how cities grew and how armies fought. Star maps, latitude grids, and universal histories shifted the mental map of the Mediterranean elite. The combination of Greek theory, Near Eastern data, royal patronage, and practical needs created a long-lived tradition that would survive the fall of kingdoms and the rise of new empires. So, when we look back at the Hellenistic world, we are not looking at a failed beginning that waited for Rome or modern Europe to finish the job. We are looking at a complex ecosystem in which politics, prestige, curiosity, and practical needs constantly interacted. Kings sought legitimacy through temples, processions, and libraries. Scientists sought patronage and respect through discoveries, devices, and books. Cities benefited from new machines, new crops, and new medical techniques. And the heavens themselves were drawn into a grand narrative of order, fate, and human ambition. That is the world our story has tried to bring to life. A world where the decline of great dynasties and the rise of new powers went hand in hand with an extraordinary effort to understand and organize both the earth beneath people's feet and the sky above their heads.